Chapter 658. Zhu Ling looked at the girl who was deep in thought and said lightly, "Come in." The person outside the door came in and looked at Yang Xinya with some hesitation. Yang Xinya stood up and said, "Young master, Xinya will leave first. We can continue the game in the future. I'll go see Lin." Zhu Ling's eyes were gentle as he nodded, "That's good. Guard Lin will be able to get out of bed in a few days. You don't have to worry." "I know. Thank you, young master." Yang Xinya thanked Zhu Ling again before leaving. Watching the girl's slender figure disappear at the door, Zhu Ling looked down at the unfinished game in front of him, lost in thought. "Young master?" The guard in front of him called out with some confusion. Zhu Ling came back to his senses and asked, "What happened?" The guard said, "These days the Mahist army has surrounded Bian City, but they haven't carried out a large-scale attack. Instead, they've only sent a few small generals to shout outside the city and casually fight for a while before retreating back to the camp. In the Mahist army, there hasn't been a single general under Mo Xiaoyao who can take charge of an area. In addition, when the two armies were fighting yesterday, the old general led 70,000 men out of the city and came to our side. I'm afraid he wants to deal with Zhang Qilan first." Zhu Ling was startled and frowned. The generals under Mo Xiaoyao didn't appear on the battlefield? "But there's only one Zhang Qilan here. Where did the others go?" The guard said, "The Mahist army secretly took some men out of the camp. The old general suspects that the Mahist army already knows of our existence. They plan to surround Bian City on the surface, but concentrate most of their forces to deal with us. I'm afraid the old general is worried, so he came to help us." Zhu Ling closed his eyes. "Who's guarding Bian City?" "General Long Yang is also in Bian City." "That's good." "No, that's not right. Mo Xiaoyao doesn't want to deal with us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city." Suddenly thinking of something, Zhu Ling's face changed and he stood up abruptly. "Mo Xiaoyao didn't appear in the Mahist army camp, nor is he with Zhang Qilan. It must be hidden somewhere else. If we don't show up, he won't be able to find us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city, and then slowly deplete Bian City's military strength." Hearing this, the guard's expression changed greatly. "Young master, what should we do?" Zhu Ling said solemnly, "Pass down the order, send troops to attack Zhang Qilan's forces. We must take down the county town before tomorrow morning so that we can help grandfather." This subordinate will go right away. Deep into the night, the quiet mountains seemed especially quiet tonight. In the courtyard hidden in the night, a slender figure briskly swept out. She avoided the night patrol guards and nimbly entered the secret study in the corner of the front yard. Even tonight, most of the soldiers in the forest had left, but the outside of the study was still heavily guarded. Shadow approached silently like a phantom. By the time the 4 guards outside the door reacted, 3 of them had already fallen to the ground. "It's you?" Whoosh! A dagger flew out and nailed itself into the heart of the last person. "Lin Han?" Shadow said in a low voice. Under the eaves, a tall and straight voice quietly fell. He walked over and looked at the 4 corpses on the ground without the slightest ripple in his eyes. "Princess?" The person who came was the guard of the Huwei general's manor, Lin, who was supposed to be lying on the bed and unable to get up. "Is the injury serious?" Yang Xinya Yili asked softly. Lin Han said in a low voice, "It avoided the vital parts, so it's not serious. It just looks serious." Yili nodded. "It's good that you're fine. Watch me, I'll go in and take a look." "Yes." Yili entered the study and came out after a while. Soon, the 2 figures disappeared from the courtyard. Not long after, a dazzling firework broke through the heavy fog in the night, blooming in the night sky of the mountains. When the sky was about to brighten, the battle in the small county town officially began. This small town was not as sturdy as Bian City. The height and thickness of the city walls were far less than Bian City. There were even some places that didn't have city walls at all. It was much more difficult to defend such a small town than to enter the palace. Therefore, Zhu Ling and his men almost didn't encounter much resistance and attacked the city. They fought fiercely with the generals of the Mahist army in the city. In a hidden corner of the city, Zhang Qilan stood on a high place with his subordinates and watched the battle in the city. His subordinate whispered, "General, the other side is estimated to have nearly 100,000 people. We should withdraw." Zhang Qilan shook his head and said, "No, according to the information given to us by the princess, the other side has at least 180,000 people. But this county town is too small. Hundreds of thousands of people can't be used at all. It's impossible for the other side to bring out all their forces." The general whispered. Zhang Qilan glanced at him angrily and said, Of course I know this. Don't you see that there are less than 100,000 people and there's almost no space left? Tell the boys on the periphery to secretly withdraw. Those who have joined the battle, fight for me. Delay them. We must delay until Zhu Yan's men arrive. Hearing this, the general said with a bitter face, if so, we really have no way to survive. Hundreds of thousands of people were enough for them. How could they survive if tens of thousands of people and an old general who had been on the battlefield came? Zhang Qilan patted his subordinate's shoulder with a smile and said, are you afraid? Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Even if there's no way to survive, we can drag a famous general of West Hill down with us. It's not a loss. The general stared and said loudly, who's afraid? I don't want to be buried with Zhu Yan. I want to follow the prince to conquer the world. Zhang Qilan laughed and said, it's good that you have this courage. I think highly of you. While they were talking, flames appeared in the east outside the city. Zhang Qilan took a deep breath and said, they're coming. Zhu Yan came so fast that they had just seen the torches and rushed to the city gate. The gate of the small county town was vulnerable. The Mahist army didn't have so many soldiers to defend the city tower. Not long after, the east gate was broken by the soldiers of West Hill. The Mahist army was sandwiched in the middle by the enemy from the west and the east. Zhang Qilan looked at the bright sky and said with some regret, it's time to retreat. When the golden horn sounded, the Mahist army did not have the slightest desire to fight and left quickly. The soldiers of West Hill had been sullen these days. Seeing the Mahist army fleeing, they wanted to go forward and chase after them. But they were stopped by Zhu Yan. Don't chase. There may be a trap ahead. Zhu Ling said. Zhu Yan nodded and said, yes. The Mahist army's retreat seems to be chaotic, but there's order in the chaos. It's not a sign of defeat. I'm afraid that they want to lure us in. After ordering the soldiers to clean up the battlefield, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan had time to talk alone. Because of Zhu Yan's identity and Zhu Ling's heavy responsibility, Zhu Ling stayed in the mountains all year round. Therefore Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan rarely saw each other. The last time they saw each other was more than half a year ago. Looking at his grandson who stood tall and firm in front of him, Zhu Yan nodded with relief. At the same time he felt very guilty for his grandson. In order to take charge of the army for him, his grandson could only stay in the mountains all year round. This child was his only relative, and also his most beloved junior. Sometimes Zhu Yan even wondered if everything he had insisted on was worth it. Chapter 659. Good boy, thank you for your hard work. Looking at Zhu Ling, Zhu Yan whispered after a long time. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, Grandfather, you are too serious. This is what I should do. By the way, why did grandfather take the army out of the city? The defense of Bian City. Zhu Yan waved his hand and said, I know Mo Xiuyao wants to lure me out. But Long Yang is in Bian City, so it doesn't matter if I am there or not. But your side. I don't know why I am always a little worried. Especially these 2 days, I always feel frightened when I think about it. What's the matter on your side? Zhu Ling shook his head and said, I am fine. Grandfather, you are too worried. His grandson will be careful in everything. Since grandfather came out, there is also a benefit. We can stay here and cooperate with General Long Yang to restrict the speed of the Mahist army's attack. What's more, we have more than 600,000 troops on both sides. Mo Xiuyao has less than 400,000 troops. Are we afraid of him? Zhu Ling would not ignore his grandfather's worry. It was not the general suspicion of the old man, but the instinctive premonition of danger of an old general. Zhu Yan patted his grandson's shoulder and said, Good boy, you have grown up. In the face of his grandfather's praise, even the calm Zhu Ling could not help but smile. The grandfather and grandson sat down and exchanged views on the current situation. Zhu Yan was even more happy about his grandson's growth. When Zhu Yan said that he saved Yang Xinya, Zhu Yan frowned and said, You said that she is the daughter of the late Huwei general. Are you sure? Zhu Ling was stunned and said, Of course I am sure. She has a lot of tokens and the waist tokens of the guards around her. In addition, I asked her a lot about Huwei general and the Ling family, and there were no flaws. Suddenly there was a bad feeling in his heart. Zhu Ling's face changed slightly and he looked at Zhu Yan uneasily. Zhu Yan frowned and said, You are right. That girl's temperament and appearance are a bit like Huwei general's daughter. But, 2 years ago when Huwei general took his wife and daughter to Li City, he visited me in Bian City. The girl of the Yang family has been spoiled since childhood, and her temperament is like Huwei general. She doesn't like music, chess, calligraphy and painting. Other than needlework, which was slightly better, she only knew a few words. I don't even know how to play chess. Then, Zhu Ling's expression immediately turned ugly. In the beginning he was also on guard against Yang Xinya. Even now he didn't let her know anything important. But after several probing he really recognized Yang Xinya's identity. Now that he suddenly found out that the other party's identity was a scam, the anger in his heart could be imagined. Grandfather. I have to go back immediately. I'm afraid. Zhu Yan's expression also became dignified. At this time, a woman of unknown origin who claimed to be the daughter of General Hu Wei suddenly appeared. How could he not feel uneasy? After thinking for a while, Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Okay, go ahead. Be careful." "Yes, grandfather, you too, old general, young master. We've been surrounded by the Mahist army." The soldier outside hurried in and reported. In fact, even if he didn't report, Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling already knew. Before his voice died away, there was a deafening sound of war drums outside the city. The two hurried out and climbed up the tower. They saw the flags fluttering under the city. The Mahist army soldiers were holding weapons and waiting for battle. The formation was solemn and they didn't look like they fled half an hour ago. In front of the army, Zhang Qilan stood straight and laughed loudly. "Old General Zhu. I, Zhang Qilan, the commander of the Mahist army's Eagle Army, have long heard of old General Zhu's name. Please enlighten me." Zhu Yan looked around. The black mass of the Mahist army in front of him had at least hundreds of thousands of people. Zhang Qilan wasn't an inexperienced general like Yun Ting and Chen Yun. With a wave of his hand, the soldiers of the Mo family army scattered in all directions. Although it looked like a mess, if one were to look closely, they would be able to see the profoundness behind it. If ordinary generals rashly entered the formation of chaotic heaven, they wouldn't be able to rush out without a considerable number of soldiers. Zhu Ling's expression changed slightly. Apparently he also saw the beauty of this formation. He said to Zhu Yan, "Grandfather, I'll go and have a try." Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Zhang Qilan is an old general of the Mahist army. Be careful." "I understand." The city gate was opened and the soldiers of West Hill rushed out. A young man in a moon-white robe didn't have time to change into a battle robe. He directly jumped from the tower to the horse that rushed out of the city gate. He kicked the horse's abdomen and rushed toward the Mahist army. With Zhu Ling in the lead, the soldiers of West Hill rampaged through the Mahist army like a dragon. They were invincible. But they couldn't rush out of the black net of the Mahist army. Behind them, Zhang Qilan, who was riding on horseback and watching the battle, touched his chin and smiled. "This guy is a bit interesting." Behind him, his subordinate reminded him, "General, you are not his opponent." Zhang Qilan's face suddenly darkened. He was not a fool. Marching to war and fighting alone were two different things. Therefore, Zhang Qilan, who grew up in the military camp, naturally knew that there would always be someone stronger than him. It wasn't shameful that he couldn't defeat a kid who was younger than him, but it wasn't pleasant to hear his subordinate say it out loud. He glared at his subordinate angrily. "You talk too much." The subordinate helplessly rolled his eyes. "Wasn't it because the prince was afraid that you would rush forward in a moment of excitement that I reminded you? Who did I offend?" It was hard to be a subordinate these days. It was even harder to be a subordinate who thought for his superior. "General? What do you think? Do you want to take this guy down?" Zhang Qilan looked back at him. "Who's going?" "You." The subordinate waved his hand and pointed to someone who was watching the battle next to him. Zhang Qilan looked at Qin Haodong's facial expression and immediately pulled a long face. "Commander Qin, are you going to tell me where the princess went? You know, if anything happens to the princess, you and I will have to bear the consequences." Qin Feng looked at him sideways and smiled. "General, don't worry. I have sent someone to pick up the princess. There will be no problem." Chapter 660. On the battlefield, Zhu Ling was invincible. The soldiers of the Mahist army could not sit still. Although Zhang Qilan knew that he was no match for Zhu Ling, he did not want to see Zhu Ling being so arrogant in front of him. "Who is this guy?" Zhang Qilan frowned and asked. Qin Feng smiled and said, "He should be a descendant of Zhu Yan, probably a grandson. I heard that Zhu Yan had a grandson, but he was weak and sickly since he was 10 years old. No one has seen him since. Many people guess that he died young. Now it seems that he is the one." Zhang Qilan nodded and said, "No wonder. The grandson of General Jing Tian is really something. Commander Qin, sorry to trouble you." Qi Lin's leader insisted on following him to defend the city. Wasn't this the purpose? Qin Feng gave a rare grin. With a pull of the reins, the well-trained warhorse whinnied and charged towards the man in moon-white clothes on the battlefield. In the fierce battle, Zhu Ling had already noticed that someone was rushing toward him. He waved away the enemy beside him and turned around to face the enemy, just in time to meet Qin Feng face to face. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows slightly and waved his long sword toward Zhu Ling's face. Zhu Ling dodged sideways on the horse and raised his long sword to fight back. The two of them fought back and forth on the horse. But they both used swords and the length of the long sword was limited. It was not convenient to fight on the horse. After dozens of rounds, the two of them jumped off the horse and landed on the battlefield. Zhu Ling shook the long sword in his hand and pointed it at Qin Feng's face. "Who are you? Tell me your name." Qin Feng smiled and said, "I am Qin Feng from the Prince Ding mansion." "Who are you?" Zhu Ling frowned slightly. His words were no different from not saying anything. But he still replied coldly, "I am Zhu Ling, the commander of the Jingwa army in Weiling." Qin Feng smiled and said, "So you are the descendant of General Zhu. Nice to meet you." Zhu Ling snorted. The two of them stopped talking and started fighting again. When Zhang Qilan saw that Zhu Ling was being held back by Qin Feng, he was instantly in a good mood. He nodded repeatedly and said, "Wang Fei was right to see Qin Feng stay behind. Wang Fei is indeed far-sighted. This general is far inferior. If it weren't for Qin Feng, this Zhu Ling would not be easy to deal with." Therefore, the interference of these martial arts experts on the battlefield was the most annoying. If he ignored them, the lethality of these experts was several times or even dozens of times stronger than ordinary soldiers. If he sent out a general to fight with them, it would be a huge loss if he lost a general who could lead troops in battle because of a Jianghu expert. Zhang Qilan decided that in the future, she would borrow a few qilin from Wang Fei for every battle. Zhang Qilan was overjoyed. Zhu Yan on the city wall was not happy. As soon as Zhu Ling was held back, the formation of the West Hill soldiers behind him was immediately in chaos. The Mahist army took the opportunity to kill. In just a moment, more than half of the West Hill soldiers were lost. Qin Feng and Zhu Ling fought very happily. Although there were many martial arts experts in the Prince Ding mansion, they were all familiar with each other, so it was not interesting to fight. And Qin Feng did not have the courage to challenge a martial arts expert like Prince Ding for the time being. Therefore, it was rare to meet an unfamiliar martial arts expert like Zhu Ling. Naturally, he was in high spirits to fight with him. Zhu Ling, who was his opponent, was complaining in his heart. He did not expect that with his skills, he would be held back by an unknown young general in the Mahist army for so long. Originally, he just wanted to kill Qin Feng as soon as possible to establish his authority. But now the fight was not over. He was already riding a tiger and could not get off. If Qin Feng did not stop, he would not be able to stop unilaterally. In this fight, he also found that Qin Feng's skills were not worse than his. If it went on like this, it was inevitable that both sides would be hurt. Then, Qin Feng could afford to be hurt, but Zhu Ling could not afford to be hurt. He was the commander of the Jingwa army, and his grandfather, Zhu Yan, was old and could not lead the army to charge and break through the enemy lines. As a result, Zhu Ling was more impatient and less calm. Qin Feng seized the opportunity to launch a series of fierce attacks. He was flustered and was almost seriously injured. On the city wall, Zhu Yan frowned as he watched Zhu Ling fighting with Qin Feng. He signaled the soldiers around him to retreat. As soon as the horn sounded, the West Hill soldiers quickly retreated into the city gate. Zhang Qilan did not let people chase after them. The city gate of this small city was easy to open, but the nearly 200,000 Shiling army in the city gate was not so easy to deal with. If they fought with the Shiling army after entering the city, the Mahist army would not be willing to accept too many casualties. Qin Feng did not want to continue fighting. He generously retreated a distance and let Zhu Ling go back to the city. Then he mounted his horse and returned to the Mahist army. "How was it?" Zhang Qilan asked. Qin Feng's face was full of satisfaction. He nodded and praised, "Master General Zhang, you'd better not rashly confront him." Zhang Qilan curled his lips and muttered discontentedly, "I know, I'm not tired of living. You boy, can you tell me now? Where did the princess go?" Don't think that Zhang Qilan was careless because he was careless. It was said that the princess who came to support them did not show up from beginning to end. How could Zhang Qilan not be anxious? Looking at the situation, even Wang Yi did not know where Wang Fei had run off to. If His Highness knew about this, wouldn't he skin him alive? General Zhang, calm down. Qin Feng comforted him. Didn't I say that I have sent people to pick up the princess? Zhang Qilan rolled his eyes at him angrily. You might as well not say it. It was to the point that she needed people to pick her up. Obviously, the place where the princess went was not so safe. Taking a deep breath, Zhang Qilan suppressed the impulse to throw this man out. What can we do? Qin Feng thought for a while and said, wait for the princess's signal, and then encircle and destroy the enemy with Feng San? Isn't Feng San in the camp? Where did he come from? Zhang Qilan roared. Qin Feng looked calm. Heaven's secret can't be revealed. General, do you understand? I don't understand. Less than a quarter of an hour after the two armies retreated, thick smoke suddenly rose from the mountains in the southwest. It was a good day with no clouds in the sky. The fog that usually lingered in the mountains also dissipated a lot. Even if they were dozens of miles away, they could see it clearly. Seeing this, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan were shocked. Grandfather. In the mountains. There were not only hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers hidden in the mountains, but also enough food for 200,000 soldiers to eat for a year. Zhu Yan naturally knew this. His old face looked gloomy. Take the soldiers back. But grandfather here? Zhu Ling said anxiously. Zhu Yan interrupted him. Don't say more. If the camp is taken by the Mahist army, we will be trapped in the city. The food can't support us for a few days. This small city was not a big city like Bian City. Even if the Mahist army did not attack, the Mahist army could encircle the city for 3 to 5 months. With an army of over 100,000 soldiers, it would only take 3 to 5 days for them to finish off all the food in this small city. At that time, they could only wait for the Mahist army to come and clean them up with hunger. The Mahist army won't have so many people. There are definitely no more than 30,000 people over there. Take the soldiers back. No matter what, you must stabilize there. Zhu Yan ordered. Chapter 661. Grandfather. Zhu Yan sighed and patted his grandson on the shoulder. Go ahead. I'll cover you. Zhu Ling gritted his teeth and nodded with red eyes. I know. Take care, grandfather. Go ahead. Zhu Ling led the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses he brought to the mountains where they had been entrenched for more than 10 years. In the small town behind him, Zhu Yan, who was over 70 years old, led less than 50,000 West Hill soldiers to guard this lonely small town. What they had to face was the murderous aura of over 100,000 strong Mo family troops behind them. Riding on the horse, Zhu Ling looked back at the small town in the night. He only heard his grandfather's old voice standing alone on the tower and looking in his direction. Zhu Ling's heart trembled. He endured the piercing pain in his eyes, whipped the horse beneath him and quickly galloped forward. The small town was not far from the mountains where the Jingwa army was stationed. 20 to 30 miles was just a matter of 2 hours for the army. But after entering the mountains they had to slow down. Even though this was a place that they could not be more familiar with after living here for more than 10 years, now the people hiding here were no longer their comrades and relatives, but their enemies hiding in the dark. Young master, the scout ahead reported that there was no movement ahead. The guard rode back to Zhu Ling and reported in a low voice. Zhu Ling said in a low voice, it's more problematic that there is no movement. I'm afraid, the people left behind are all gone. Before he left 30,000 soldiers in the mountains. If they came back, how could there be no movement at all? Now, looking at the dark and silent mountains in front of him, Zhu Ling wiped away the last bit of hope in his heart. Young master, that Miss Yang is really... The guard could not continue. Although they had only known each other for a few days, he had a good impression of Miss Yang. At the same time, he could see that his young master treated the girl differently. They lived in the mountains all year round and rarely had contact with outsiders. If the young master and Miss Yang could be together, it would be a good thing. But he did not expect. Thinking of the weak and gentle girl, Zhu Ling's face darkened. He never thought that he would be deceived by a woman, and that woman. Even now, he still had a trace of hope that this was just a misunderstanding. However, his rationality also told him that there was no such thing as a coincidence in this world. Looking at his young master's gloomy face in the dark night, the guard quickly changed the topic and said, Young master, after passing this call, we will reach our camp. Tell the people in front to be careful. Zhu Ling nodded and said in a deep voice. But sometimes, it was useless to be careful. The path in the mountains was narrow, and the soldiers in front of them passed through safely without any incident. Just as everyone was about to relax, a loud sound rang out from the mountains. People were shocked to see a huge rock being pushed down from the top of the mountain by something. Then there was a rumbling sound all around and countless rocks rolled down from the sides of the hill. Soon the path forward and backward was blocked. Needless to say, the wails and cries for help from the countless soldiers who were smashed by the rocks instantly resounded throughout the entire forest. Soon, countless torches were lit on both sides of the mountain. In an instant they lit up the dark forest like two dazzling dragons. Some of the West Hill soldiers trapped in the valley cried out in panic, and some had already counterattacked. But the other side was on high ground, and the Mahist army's archery was famous in all countries. For a moment, the valley was filled with the thick smell of blood. Zhu Ling stood silently in the midst of the chaos. The bodyguards around him loyally deflected the arrows that were shot at him. His handsome face was filled with malice and anger in the flickering light of the fire, but he was powerless in the face of the rain of arrows pouring down from above. More than a decade of hard work, more than 20 years of his grandfather's painstaking efforts, had it been destroyed before he could even react? Today, it was not only the hundreds of thousands of the Zhu family's Jingwa army that were destroyed in this small valley. It was also his more than a decade of painstaking effort, more than a decade of patience and ambition. In the end he was still too young. What Zhu Ling did not understand was that heroes were born in troubled times. However, there were only a few heroes in a chaotic world. Most of them were cannon fodders who were buried with the heroes. And in this world, there was no rule that whoever sacrificed enough would become a hero in troubled times. "Young master, leave quickly." The guard behind him pushed him, bringing him back to his senses. Only then did Zhu Ling see that the guards around him were already wounded, but they still surrounded him and bitterly held on. But the terrain was already extremely unfavorable to them, and the Mahist army's archers were not so easy to resist. At this time they were already at the end of the road. Zhu Ling smiled bitterly. "Leave? Where can I go?" "Anywhere is good. Where there is life there is hope. Young master, leave quickly." The guard hurriedly called out and could not help but push Zhu Ling again, reminding him sternly, "Young master, don't forget that the old general is still waiting for you." Zhu Ling was startled as if he had really come back to his senses. Looking up, the valley was a scene of devastation, and less than 20% of the soldiers could stand up. "Protect young master. Kill our way out," the person beside him roared. Soon, the loyal guards and retainers of the Zhu family all rushed over, supporting Zhu Ling as he rushed forward. They had lived in this forest for more than 20 years, and naturally understood where they had the best chance of escaping. The remaining soldiers seemed to understand that they were in a desperate situation, and they all roared as they rushed up the hills on both sides, wanting to perish together with the enemy. However, even more of them were shot down again. Occasionally there were a few who climbed to the top, but they could not escape the sharp blades of the Mahist army that were already waiting there. The group of people protecting Zhu Ling were all experts in martial arts, but in the end, only 7 or 8 of them managed to escape the valley. Once they got out of the encirclement and entered the forest, it would be their world. No matter how strong the Mahist army was, it would be extremely difficult to find them in this kind of mountain range. But once they rushed out of the valley, the scene in front of them still shocked them. Even in the darkness of the night, they could still see the tragic scene of corpses strewn across the field through the dim moonlight, and the thick smell of blood in the air. These were the soldiers who had rushed out first. Unfortunately, they did not die in the barrage of arrows in the valley, but they were still unable to escape the enemy's ambush outside. "Young master, let's go." A guard riddled with wounds pulled Zhu Ling aside and said hoarsely. "Let's go," Zhu Ling said hoarsely. "Young master Zhu." An elegant and graceful voice drifted through the bloody forest. Zhu Ling's heart trembled and he raised his head to look. Not far from the mountain path, a white-clothed girl stood in the wind. Under the dim moonlight, the girl's face revealed a crystalline luster, and her graceful and elegant eyes held a faint luster. She suddenly appeared in this dark and bloody mountain battlefield, making people feel like she was a banshee of the forest. Chapter 662. Who are you? Zhu Ling's voice was dry and pale as he stared at the young girl in front of him and asked with difficulty. The white-clothed young girl smiled faintly at him and said apologetically, "I am Yi Li, Yi Li." Such an ordinary word, such an ordinary name. But in Zhu Ling's ears, these 2 words were like a thunderclap from the 9th heaven, deafening. A beat later Zhu Ling slowly laughed. "Yi Li? Yi Li. Appointed king's consort Yi Li, ha!" As though he had heard something funny, Zhu Ling's laughter grew louder and louder until he couldn't breathe. "You are Princess Ding?" Yi Li nodded and said, "I am Princess Ding." "You lied to me." Zhu Ling gritted his teeth. Yi Li nodded. "I lied to you." There was some regret and helplessness in her clear eyes, but there was no regret or guilt. When 2 armies fought, there was no good or evil, no right or wrong. There were only positions. If they had different positions, then they were enemies. Against enemies? No matter the means, this was the principle that Yi Li recognized in her previous life. Princess Ding? Zhu Ling murmured in a low voice. I heard that in the past, the army of Lei Jinting of Genom King of Gojoseon was almost completely wiped out by Princess Ding. Today Zhu Ling lost to Princess Ding again, but it wasn't a loss. To have Wang Fei go through so much trouble, it is the fortune of 3 lifetimes. Yi Li said with a helpless smile, Zhu Gongzi's army of 100,000 is not a lot, but our army is lacking soldiers right now. If Gongzi suddenly appeared, it would cause a lot of trouble for the Mahist army. In desperate times we can only use desperate measures. If I have been rude, please forgive me. You have targeted the Jing Guojun from the start? Zhu Ling asked. Yi Li smiled faintly and did not deny it. Old General Zhu has silently hidden more than 100,000 soldiers and horses near Bian City. Presumably he also has a lot of provisions. To tell you the truth, the first thing we are interested in is not young Master Zhu's army, but the provisions to feed them. Not far away, Feng Zhiyao strolled over in a bright red brocade robe. The long sword in his hand was still dripping with blood. Yi Li smiled helplessly. She looked at Feng Zhiyao and asked, "Why are you here?" Feng Zhiyao said with a smile, "Wang Fei is personally in danger. If I don't come, how can I explain to the prince?" Yi Li frowned and looked at Feng Zhiyao indifferently. "You don't have to tell him." Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows. Did Wang Fei think that it was possible to hide it? Seeing the exchange of glances between the two, Zhu Ling's expression dimmed. He sighed softly and looked calmly at the young woman in white. What does Wang Fei want? Yi Li was silent for a moment and then said faintly, "Young master, please come back with us." Zhu Ling was silent. A moment later he raised his head and laughed. Pointing at Yi Li, he said loudly, "I, Zhu Ling, have accomplished nothing in my life. But as a member of the Zhu family, I will not be a prisoner. I will not give you the chance to threaten my grandfather." Yi Li sighed regretfully and said, "Then what does young master want?" Zhu Ling took the long sword of the guard next to him and pointed at the black cloud cavalry behind Feng Zhiyao. He said in a low voice, "I ask for death in battle." The smile on Feng Zhiyao's face slowly faded and was replaced by a serious expression. In his view, Zhu Ling was still immature. In a few more years, his achievements would be above his own. As a general, even if the other was a defeated general, he admired and was willing to fulfill his wish. He casually cut a piece of cloth and wiped the blood off the sword. Feng Zhiyao nodded and said, "Young Master Zhu, please." "Wait." Yi Li's voice came from the side. Feng Zhiyao raised an eyebrow and put away his long sword to look at Yi Li. Yi Li raised her hand to stop Lin Han behind her. She slowly walked forward and looked at the youth whose clothes were stained with blood. She said softly and clearly, "This consort is willing to fight with young Master Wang Fei." Feng Zhiyao and the others were shocked and wanted to stop her. Even though Zhu Ling's army had been defeated, Zhu Ling himself was still an expert. The bloodstains on his body weren't his. In fact, Zhu Ling hadn't really done anything tonight. Yi Li waved her hand to stop Feng Zhiyao and the others from trying to persuade her. She slowly walked in front of Zhu Ling. "This consort is willing to fight with young master. Is this possible? I have heard that Wang Fei is also an expert. This one is fortunate. Please." In the not-so-vast forest, corpses were strewn everywhere and blood flowed like a river. On the battlefield littered with the corpses of Shiling soldiers, a man in white and a woman in white stood facing each other calmly. If not for the corpses and blood-stained swords, this would have been a beautiful scene. Not far away there was a crowd silently watching them. The long sword in Zhu Ling's hand trembled and drew out 2 silver sword flowers. Yi Li smiled faintly at him. A snow-white dagger flashed at her fingertips. It seemed to only pause for a moment. The 2 figures charged at each other at great speed. For a moment, the 2 figures intersected and then tangled together. Zhu Ling's sword was filled with sword energy. Yi Li's dagger also flashed with a dark and cold aura. Zhu Ling quickly found that he could not gain any advantage against this woman in close combat. It even greatly restricted his swordsmanship. So he quickly pulled away from Yi Li. However, how could Yi Li give him the chance to do so? Her cold dagger was like a maggot that stuck to his bones as it brushed past his clothes again and again. The skin under his clothes was also stirred up by a layer of chill. The long sword and short dagger collided. Yi Li's hand holding the dagger trembled slightly. After all, it was difficult for a woman to compete against a man in strength. Frowning, the dagger moved along the blade and sliced at Zhu Ling's wrist. Zhu Ling lowered his wrist and hurriedly dodged. "Princess Ding is very skilled. Young Master Zhu praises me too much." Outside the battlefield, Feng Zhiyao frowned as he stared at the 2 fighting. But he had to admit that Wang Fei had improved quickly in the past few years. Even against a rare expert like Zhu Ling, she was not at a disadvantage. Lin Han had come to his side at some point. He was also staring at the two fighting. He asked, "Young Master Feng San, why are you here?" "General Zhang." Feng Jiao said, "Qin Feng is enough there. Even if he is not enough, he can stall for time until we get back. I am worried about Wang Fei going into danger alone. But are your wounds okay?" Lin Han rubbed his back and shook his head. That wound looked fierce and dangerous, but the person who had done it had calculated and avoided a vital spot. It could only count as a flesh wound. Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and smiled. "I think it should be fine. This young master did it personally. This young master calculated well, didn't he? Many thanks to young Master Feng San for showing mercy." Lin Han gritted his teeth. Even though he had done it willingly, no one would be in a good mood after being cut for no reason. What's more, the culprit was still there proudly taking credit for it. Lin Han deeply felt that this young Master Feng San should be taught a lesson. Chapter 663. Wang Fei, be careful. Feng Jiao, who had been laughing merrily, saw the silver light flash and hurriedly warned in a stern voice. On the other side, one of Zhu Ling's subordinates looked at Yi Li, who was evenly matched with Zhu Ling, and a vicious light flashed through his eyes. The moment Yi Li and Zhu Ling separated, a hidden weapon flashing with silver light shot out. Hearing Feng Jiao's warning, Yi Li also heard the sound of a hidden weapon breaking through the air behind her. Without turning her head, she swung the dagger in her hand backwards to block the hidden weapon behind her. But Zhu Ling, who was not far away, suddenly leapt at her. Yi Li frowned slightly. Just as she was about to send out a palm strike, she saw Zhu Ling push her aside. The hidden weapon shot into Zhu Ling's chest without any obstruction. "Young master!" the guard shouted harshly. Before they could react, the long arrows of the Mahist army had penetrated their chests. Yi Li steadied herself and turned to look at the person on the ground. A hint of shock flashed across her beautiful face. Feng Jiao saw that Wang Fei was fine and released a breath. He hurriedly led people forward to see if there was anyone alive in that group to prevent another hidden weapon like the one just now. That hidden weapon was a common willow leaf dart. The entire dart had shot into Zhu Ling's chest, and only the head of the dart glowing with a blue light was exposed. Feng Jiao's expression changed slightly. He said, "There's poison on the dart." Lin Han looked at Zhu Ling on the ground and said faintly, "Even if he did not block it, the dart would not have hit Wang Fei." Originally, Yi Li's dagger could have knocked the dart away, but it had been knocked aside by Zhu Ling. Zhu Ling was lying on the ground covered in blood. His upper body was pillowed on the body of a soldier who had been dead for a long time. His eyes were dim as he looked at Yi Li in front of him. His lips moved, but he did not say anything in the end. Yi Li lowered her head to look at him and said indifferently, "Why do you have to do this?" The handsome young man forced a smile on his lips and said, "I've lost. My life is actually like this," Yi Li said calmly. "Victory and defeat are common in war. You can only flip your cards if you're alive. If you're dead, you'll have nothing." Zhu Ling was stunned for a moment before he quickly shook his head and smiled at her. "What's the point of saying all this now? I never thought that I would be defeated like this. Just like how I never thought that you would actually be the chosen imperial concubine." Yi Li was silent. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, "You don't have to feel sorry. I'm also tired. The poison on the willow leaf dart was obviously not an ordinary poison. After a while, black blood flowed out from the corner of Zhu Ling's mouth and he slowly closed his eyes. Yi Li looked at the scene of corpses lying in front of her. She looked at the young man whose moon-white clothes were already stained with blood. She closed her eyes peacefully. Suddenly she felt a bone-chilling cold and couldn't help but wrap her arms around herself. "Princess, he didn't want to live. It's not your fault," Lin Han whispered. Even if Zhu Ling didn't block the dart, Princess would be fine. They could see it clearly from so far away, so could Zhu Ling, who was next to them. From the moment he pulled out his sword and asked for the battle, he already had the will to die. Such a proud young man had tasted such a crushing defeat in the first battle of his life. He had no reason to let himself live. "I know." Yi Li nodded and said, "Clean up the battlefield and go back to reinforce General Zhang." "Yes, Princess," Feng Jiao replied. In a small town dozens of miles away, Zhu Yan, who couldn't sleep late at night, stood on the city wall and looked into the distance. Suddenly, an inexplicable tremor made him stunned. He stared blankly at the southwest direction and moved his lips. 2 lines of turbid tears slowly flowed down his wrinkled face. Ling'er, the West Hill defenders in the small town suddenly launched an attack in the 4th night watch period. Although the Mahist army had been vigilant, the 4th night watch period was the time when most soldiers were sleeping. The sudden attack caused the Mo family army to be in a state of chaos. But after all, the Mahist army was an elite army. Soon they reacted and fought with Zhu Yan's Shilling army. What's going on? Why did Zhu Yan suddenly attack? Behind the army, Zhang Qilan stared at the battlefield in front of him and asked in a deep voice. He had been in the army for half of his life, so it was easy for him to see that the morale of the West Hill defenders in front of him was completely different from before. It was clear that they wanted to die together with the Mahist army. Looking up at the old figure standing on the city wall in the distance, Zhang Qilan always felt that something had happened that he didn't know. With Zhu Yan's experience and ability in war, it was absolutely impossible for him to make such a decision. On the other hand, Qin Feng, who was at the side, had a calm expression. He said indifferently, "It's probably because Princess Consort and the others succeeded. But, we haven't received the news yet. How did Zhu Yan get the news?" Succeeded? Zhang Qilan turned around and grabbed Qin Feng's collar and said, "You haven't told me, where did Princess go?" Qin Feng slowly slapped away the hand that was grabbing his collar and said, "Wang Fei has gone to investigate where Zhu Ling's army of 100,000 is staying. And, there should be a large number of provisions there. In this way we don't have to worry about provisions and military supplies in a short time." What? Zhang Qilan was shocked. Princess went? Qin Feng laughed and said, "Otherwise, why do you think we are guarding this useless county these days? If they hide in the mountains and refuse to come out, even if we send in 300 or 400,000 troops, we may not be able to do anything to them. Now they come out by themselves, right? As soon as they come out, we can take the opportunity to destroy that place. The 100,000 troops that went back last night are probably gone. Otherwise Zhu Yan wouldn't be so crazy." Zhang Qilan took a few deep breaths. He felt that he was almost scared to death by this sudden news. But, this was good news, wasn't it? Even if Zhu Yan was crazy, he was not afraid of him in this dark fight. The difference in strength between the two sides was not much. It was hard to say who would win in the end. In the chaotic battle between the two armies, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. The Mahist army soldiers who were familiar with them all showed joy. "It's the Black Cloud Cavalry. The Black Cloud Cavalry is coming." In the southwest, a black cavalry swept over like a gust of wind. They rushed into the battlefield quickly. Soon the battle that was originally evenly matched became one-sided. Behind the black cavalry, Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao rode horses one after the other and quickly merged into the camp of the Mahist army. Seeing Yi Li coming back from afar, Zhang Qilan quickly led people to greet her. "Princess." Yi Li glanced at the battlefield in front of her and of course saw the lonely old figure on the tower. She paused for a moment and said, "General Zhang, you don't have to be so polite. How is the battle?" Zhang Qilan smiled and said, "Princess, don't worry. With the Black Cloud Cavalry joining in, the defenders of Shilling will be wiped out before dawn." Seeing Yi Li come back with his own eyes, Zhang Qilan was completely relieved. A few days ago, the princess came with Qin Feng and others, saying that they were under the order of the prince to help him defend the city. But ever since the princess consort came, he had never seen her again. It was not until just now that he knew what the princess saw. It only scared him so much that his heart was still trembling. If something happened to the princess, how could they explain it to the prince? Chapter 664. Congratulations, Your Highness. You have wiped out hundreds of thousands of Jinghua army without any effort. Zhang Qilan smiled. Yi Li smiled faintly and shook her head. If it weren't for the general, it wouldn't be so easy. The killing continued until the sky was dark. The West Hill defenders finally could not resist and gradually retreated into the city. The city gates and walls of the small city were unable to provide any form of defense. The Mo family army and the Black Cloud Cavalry only used less than 2 hours to knock open the city gates and once again charge into the small city. In fact, there were not many West Hill defenders in the small city. Only intermittent fighting sounds came from some streets and alleys from time to time. Yi Li and the others stepped into the city. The soldiers who entered the city first came to report, "General Zhu Yan is still on the tower." Everyone looked at each other. Yi Li whispered, "Let's go and see." The others naturally had no objection. They followed Yi Li and stepped on the tower of the small city. In the corner of the tower, Zhu Yan was wearing an old battle robe. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked in the direction of Bien City in the distance. Even Yi Li and the others did not seem to hear it. Yi Li was not in a hurry. She just calmly looked at the back of the old man. After a long time, Zhu Yin slowly turned around and looked at everyone. Finally, his eyes fell on Yi Li, who was in white, and reached out his hand. He asked in a deep voice, "This is Miss Yang?" Yi Li cupped her hands and said respectfully with a faint smile, "Junior Yi Li greets General Zhu." Zhu Yin nodded and smiled. "Is she really the princess? She is so young. She is really a young talent. The Prince Ding mansion is blessed." Yi Li whispered, "Senior, you flatter me." Zhu Yin looked at her with a trace of indescribable strangeness in his eyes. After hesitating for a moment, he asked, "My useless grandson, how did you deal with him?" Yi Li sighed slightly and whispered, "Master Zhu has died in the battle. I'm sorry for your loss." Zhu Yan's body trembled slightly. His hand holding the spear could not help but shake. In the end, he could only look up at the sky and let out a long sigh. He said, "So he died in battle. Fine. It's my fault. Originally he could have." His only grandson had been very intelligent and talented since he was young. If it wasn't for him, he could have lived a free life with fame and fortune. Because of him, because of his wishes and ambitions, Zhu Ling had hidden himself deep in the mountains at the age of 12 or 13, refusing to see outsiders. Even if he died on the battlefield, no one would ever know his name, and he would never receive the status and glory that he deserved. Of Zhu Yan's his mansion, of sorry for of his death. Master Zhu Yan's Zhu Yan of his. Zhu Yan shook his head and said, "Princess Ding, you don't have to persuade me. I'm almost 70 years old. I've lived long enough. Since I've lost today, I have nothing to say." Feng Jiao frowned slightly and said loudly, "Why do you say that, General Zhu? The Mahist army is not a ruthless person." Zhu Yan looked at Feng Jiao and could not help but laugh. He laughed and said, "Do you mean that the Mahist army still wants to persuade me to surrender? I'm of no use to the Mahist army. It's more, I've fought for the West Hill for half of my life. In the end, I've lost my integrity. It's ridiculous." Yi Li looked down and said lightly, "General, you misunderstood me. You are of noble character and unquestionable integrity. The Mahist army dare not persuade you to surrender. Now that victory and defeat have been decided between us, the old general has long since retired. Please leave now. The Prince Ding mansion will not make things difficult for you." Zhu Yan looked at Yi Li and asked, "Aren't you afraid that I'll come back and fight against the Mahist army after I leave?" Yi Li shook her head and said, "I believe in you, General." After a long silence on the gate tower, Zhu Yan finally laughed loudly and shook his head. He said, "Thank you for your kindness, Princess. It's a pity." Zhu Yan was Jingtian General of the West Hill in life and death. Today Zhu Yan is defeated. He has no face to see the elders and the late Emperor of the West Hill. I'd rather die. Old General, Zhu Ling calmly looked at the woman in white in front of him, with a touch of regret and helplessness in his eyes. It's a pity? How could he not know that his grandson was brought up by him? When Linger mentioned the woman named Yang Xinya to him, he knew that the woman was a little different in his eyes. Now he finally saw a woman who could make his grandson look at her differently. But it was a pity. Fate made fools of people. Old General Zhu? Under everyone's shocked gazes, the old man, who was already 70 years old, suddenly leaped up and fell off the city wall. Yi Li stepped forward. Her sleeves moved slightly, but she stopped in the end. The crowd went forward and stood on the gate to look down. At the gate of the city, the old man lay quietly. Blood slowly flowed out from under him, dyeing the ground under him and the white hair on his head red. Yi Li silently looked at the old man who had lost his life under the city wall. Her eyes were sad. "Princess?" Feng Jiao asked worriedly. Yi Li calmly turned around and said, "Restrain yourself. Give him a proper burial." "Yes." Chapter 665. Bien City. The Mahist army outside Bien City and the Shilling army stationed in Bien City carried out a routine confrontation every day. The leaders of the Mahist army were a group of young men under the age of 30. No matter how hard they tried, it was difficult for them to cause any impact to Long Yang's defense. But in this kind of non-stop attack every day, Long Yang gradually sensed a conspiracy. But he could not understand what the Mahist army wanted to do. "Old General, the Mahist army is outside the city again." Lei Tingfeng strode in and looked at Long Yang, who was sitting behind the desk in deep thought. Although there was no clear victor between the Mahist army these days, Lei Tingfeng was still satisfied with the current situation. He was not a radical person, and now he did not hope to be able to defeat the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. As long as he could delay until his father and the reinforcements arrived, he would have won. Long Yang frowned and said, "Ignore them for now." Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "I'm afraid not. This time it seems to be different from before." Long Yang stood up and said, "I'll go take a look." When he went up the tower and looked down, it was indeed different from the previous few days. Although he still did not see Imo Xiaoyao and the other main generals, the Mahist army's aura and formation were unprecedentedly strong compared to a few days ago. The one standing in front of the formation was still Yun Ting. These days, Yun Ting and the group of young generals had been hit hard enough. No matter how much effort they put into arranging the troops, attacking openly and sneakily, Long Yang could easily resolve it. If it was not a serious time for the two armies to face off, they would almost think that Long Yang was playing with them. After being hit hard, these young people also gradually restrained their arrogance. Every time they faced off they became more careful. They did not expect to be able to break through Bian City, but it was enough to delay Long Yang's line of sight and occasionally create some trouble for him. After calming down, the young generals also understood that the prince and Wang Fei would not really let those old generals play and leave the Mahist army to these young people who did not know anything. Such an arrangement must mean that the prince and Wang Fei had some secret plans. The prince did not expect them to be able to take Bian City, so they had to cooperate with the prince and Wang Fei's plan. Sure enough, a few days later, they received another order from the prince. At the same time, they also understood what those capable seniors in the army were doing. "Long Yang, what kind of ability is it to hide in the city? Come out and fight me if you have the guts." Yun Ting shouted. Long Yang looked down at the young man and said with a smile, "Young man, if you have the ability, come up and talk to me." Phase SSS Yun Ting sneered, "So be it. Do you think this general is afraid of you?" "Ah, General Long, do you want to know how your General Zhu is?" Long Yang's heart was cold. He squinted and said, "What do you want to say?" Yun Ting laughed, "Zhu Yan is dead, and the hundreds of thousands of Jinghua army hidden in the mountains have been wiped out. Do you think that if you hide in the city every day, our prince can't do anything about it? Or do you really think that there is no one in the Mahist army? We are just here to play with you. When the prince has dealt with Zhu Yan and the Jinghua army, he will naturally come back to meet you, General Feng Tian." Zhu Yan was dead. Hearing this, not only Long Yang and Lei Tingfeng were shocked, but also the generals of the West Hill army guarding the city were shocked. Although the reputation of the three famous generals of West Hill had been suppressed by Genom of Gojoseon for more than 20 years, the generals and soldiers naturally knew about them. Bian City had been besieged for only a few days, and hundreds of thousands of Jinghua army had been wiped out. Even General Jing Tian had died in battle. How could the generals and soldiers of West Hill not be shocked? After all, Long Yang was a veteran of the battlefield. He suppressed the shock in his heart and sneered, "You're exaggerating. Come up and let me have a look." Yun Ting was not as angry as a few days ago when he was provoked by Long Yang. He smiled and waved the war flag in his hand. Behind the Mahist army camp, the war drums suddenly sounded, and the soldiers of the Mahist army also followed the movement of the flags and moved into battle formation. It was obvious that they were ready to attack the city. Long Yang only took a glance and understood why Lei Tingfeng said that today was different from a few days ago. Such a huge battle formation was definitely not something that these young generals in front of him could set up. This also showed that the Mahist army had no patience to confront them. At the same time, Long Yang understood that what the young general of the Mahist army said was probably not false. The hidden hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in Zhu Yan were all gone. Sighing helplessly, Long Yang ordered his men to stay in the city. "Old General, is old General Zhu?" Lei Tingfeng asked worriedly. Long Yang said lightly, "It bodes ill rather than well." "Then we?" Lei Tingfeng asked. Long Yang looked at him and shook his head, "We can't go out of the city to fight anymore. Defend and wait for reinforcements." "Yes," Lei Tingfeng said quietly. Under the city tower, Yun Ting looked at the West Hill soldiers who were guarding the city gate and refused to come out to fight. He could not help but stomp his feet. Chen Yun helplessly tugged at Yun Ting's sleeve and said, "As your highness expected, the enemy won't come out and fight us in close quarters." Yun Ting angrily said, "I don't believe that he can hide in the city forever. Killing god of the western region? He's more like a coward." Chen Yun smiled and said, "He doesn't have to hide in the city for a lifetime. As long as he can defend for a month or two when the West Hill reinforcements arrive, we will be in trouble." Yun Ting said impatiently, "I don't believe that there is no way to get him out of the city. Fight for me? There was a moat in front of Bien City. The river was quite wide. If they wanted to cross the river, they would have to lower the drawbridge or find a way on their own. In the past few days, the young generals did not completely waste their time arguing with the other side. They had ordered the craftsmen in the Mahist army to build more than a dozen long ladders. Once they were placed on the surface of the river, they could cross the river by laying down wooden planks. Chen Yun looked at the soldiers in front of him braving the enemy's arrow rain to set up the bridge planks. Many of them had already died in the chaotic arrows. He could not help but grit his teeth. For a city like Bien City that was easy to defend and hard to attack, it was impossible to break through without paying a certain amount of casualties. Even if they braved the arrow rain, they still managed to set up the bridge. The archery skills of the Mahist army soldiers were not just for show. Even from the bottom to the top, many West Hill soldiers fell off the city wall. Most of the Mahist army crossed the moat. Some people climbed up the ladders to the top of the city wall. Some people shot arrows from the bottom to the top of the city wall. The water in the moat behind them gradually turned red. Behind the Mahist army, Mo Xiaoyao appeared on the battlefield with a group of people. They did not participate in the battle. Instead, they stood in the distance and watched quietly. After a long time, they heard Mo Xiaoyao laugh and say, "Yun Ting and the others look pretty good." They had lost more than they won, but they could still hold on. They could even raise the morale of the Mahist army. For these young generals who had not really been on the battlefield, it was already pretty good. Chapter 666. Beside him, Zhuojing smiled and said, "Don't the prince and consort trust them?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded and looked up at the city wall in the distance. He said in a low voice, "Get ready to attack." Yes. Dark clouds covered thousands of miles in the clear sky. A low and hoarse voice sounded in the air, and soon beautiful fireworks bloomed in the air. Some of the West Hill soldiers guarding the city were shocked to find that there were ropes hanging in the air in several directions outside the city. Then black figures moved along the ropes and quickly moved towards the city. Long Yang could naturally see this situation. His eyes narrowed and he said sternly, "Shoot." Countless arrows flew towards the people sliding on the ropes. But even faster, a group of men in black appeared in the city and mercilessly shot their bows at the soldiers guarding the city. What's going on? How did these people appear? Black figures wearing Mahist army uniforms kept appearing in the city. These people were different from the usual Mahist army. They were obviously stronger than the Mahist army soldiers. They were a group of a few dozen people, and everywhere they went, the West Hill defenders suffered heavy losses. At the same time, they had to take care of the Mahist army outside the city, which was attacking with all their might. For a moment, the West Hill defenders were in a mess. On the city wall, Long Yang and Lei Tingfeng's faces were ashen. "Old General," Long Yang gritted his teeth and said, "Capture everyone in the city from Dechu State and the northwest and bring them up to the city tower." "Old General." Lei Tingfeng's face changed when he heard this. Of course he knew what Long Yang wanted to do. In fact, there were many who did this when two countries were at war. However, Lei Tingfeng was doubtful about how effective this would be. Gritting his teeth, Lei Tingfeng turned and left. Although there were many Mahist army in the city, there were still hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders in Bien City. It was difficult for the small Mahist army to affect the overall situation. In less than an hour, the West Hill soldiers had captured the people of Dechu State in Bien City and brought them to the top of the city wall. Bien City was the second largest city in West Hill, and its prosperity was no less than that of the Emperor of Xiling. There were many people from different countries living here. Most of them were citizens of Dechu State, and a large portion of them were citizens of the Northwest Mahist Army. These people were taken to the top of the city wall and placed on top of the battlements of Bien City. If the Mahist army below wanted to come up, they would have to get past them first. If they wanted to shoot, they would have to kill them first. Most of these people were ordinary people, and the sudden experience of war was enough to make them tremble with fear. Now they were even brought to the top of the city wall to block the Mahist army's arrows. Many of them were so scared that they started to cry. "Long Yang, you shameless old man." Seeing this, Yun Ting finally couldn't help but curse again. Beside him, Chen Yun and the others also had ugly expressions. Not to mention that these people were citizens of Dechu State and the Northwest. Even if they were citizens of West Hill, using ordinary people to block arrows was a shameful thing for a general. "What do we do now?" "How would I know?" "Go and report to the prince," Chen Yun said. After all, they weren't cold-hearted. On the battlefield, it was their duty to fight to the death between two armies. But it was difficult for them to make the decision to shoot these ordinary people who had no power to resist. In fact, there was no need for them to report. Emo Xiuyao, who had been behind the Mahist army all this time, naturally saw the situation. Standing beside him, Zhuojing frowned and said, "Prince, what should we do?" They really hadn't expected Long Yang to do this. But when Long Yang was young, he had been called the killing god of the western region. In the past, he had killed many ordinary people in the western region. His actions were unexpected but also reasonable. Emo Xiuyao stood up and stared calmly at the top of the city wall in the distance. He wants to delay us first and clear out the Qilin in the city. Bian City's defenses were very good. They had spent so many days, but the Mahist army that could enter Bian City was less than 1,000 people. If they were faced with hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders, they had no chance of winning. Long Yang didn't want to be attacked from the front and the back. He had to clear out the enemy who had entered the city and figure out how they had entered. And all of this needed time. Let's go and take a look. Because of the people on the city wall, the Mahist army's attack on the city temporarily stopped. But the soldiers on both sides didn't let down their guard. The Mahist army's black camp suddenly parted to form a path. A white-haired man in white walked out of the army, followed by a few guards and generals. Emo Xiuyao raised his hand and glanced at the people on the city wall who had been pushed out. He said in a low voice, "West Hill General Fengtan, I've heard a lot about you." Long Yang appeared on the city wall and looked at the white-haired man in the distance. He nodded and said, "Prince Ding Emo Xiuyao? Nice to meet you." When these words were said, the people on the city wall who were sobbing and crying were all stunned. They looked at the white-haired man below the city wall. Some people even became excited and shouted for help. "Prince Ding is here. Prince Ding is here. Your Highness, please save us." Someone shouted and very quickly more people started crying and shouting. Suddenly there was a wave of crying on the city wall. "What do you want, General Fengtan?" Emo Xiuyao asked calmly. His voice wasn't loud and didn't even have the slightest hint of anger. But strangely, it spread throughout the entire battlefield amidst the crying. Long Yang looked at him deeply and said, "As a general, I am deeply ashamed to use such a method. But, Prince, please give the order to retreat for 30 li." Emo Xiuyao asked, "What if I don't agree?" Long Yang smiled calmly. He raised his hand and the head of the man closest to him was chopped off on the spot, falling down the city wall. Blood immediately gushed out, startling the people on the side and causing them to scream again. Emo Xiuyao was silent for a moment. Finally, he raised his head and said calmly, "Once Bian City is broken, I will kill you. This king wants to tear you to shreds." Long Yang didn't seem to care. If Bian City falls, then this old man's life will come to an end. Since I will die anyway, what difference does it make? What is Prince's answer? Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. He said in a low voice, "I's answer is..." Whoosh! Emo Xiuyao turned around and took a bow and arrow from the hands of a soldier next to him. Drawing the bow and releasing the arrow, he completed the entire set of actions in an instant. Everyone watched in a daze as the arrow with a silver light streaked across the sky and sank into the chest of a young man on the city wall. Emo Xiuyao threw the bow and arrow back and said in a low voice, "Attack the city." Once the order was given, the sounds of killing rose again. The first to be affected were the innocent people on the city wall. Amidst the sounds of killing and crying, Emo Xiuyao turned around and left indifferently, leaving behind a cold figure and a low and gloomy voice. "Long Yang, I want all the people in your city to be buried with you." The fierce siege continued without rest. This time, both sides understood that it was no longer a small fight like a few days ago. Unless one side was defeated and the other side was victorious, there would be no rest. Perhaps because of the hundreds of innocent Dechu state people on the city wall, the Mahist army's attack became even more dauntless. After a few hours, Bian City's defense finally showed signs of decline. Chapter 667. In the city, Long Yang was sitting in an empty room with a gloomy look. He knew that Zhu Yan was dead. It wouldn't be long before Bian City was broken. Perhaps it was his fortune to be able to fight on the battlefield in his old age. However, such an inexplicable fiasco made it difficult for him to face it. One of his biggest mistakes was that he heard Emo Xiuyao's words clearly when he left. The whole city was buried with him. Emo Xiuyao wanted to massacre the city. Long Yang didn't doubt Emo Xiuyao's words. When he was young, he had massacred a city before. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been called the god of killing in the western region. In fact, if he was young, he might not think that it was a big deal for Emo Xiuyao to want to massacre a city. but now he was old after all. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Bien City. If Emo Xiuyao really massacred the whole city, General? The soldier outside the door came in a hurry to report. Long Yang opened his eyes and said indifferently, "What's the matter?" The soldier said, "The East City can't be defended. General, please retreat as soon as possible." Retreat? Long Yang frowned and asked, "Who said to retreat?" Perhaps Long Yang's tone was too harsh. The soldier reported carefully, "It's Prince Genom of Gojoseon. Genom of Gojoseon said that Bien City can't be defended. He wants to retreat to Rongqing behind to stop the Mahist army." Long Yang shook his head and smiled bitterly, "Even Bien City can't stop the Mahist army. How can Rongqing, that fragile city wall, stop the Mahist army? Stupid. The whole army stays and fights with the Mahist army in the city. Maybe we can take down half of the Mahist army." Many times, fighting in the city was filled with people's lives. It had little to do with tactics. Moreover, they could take the initiative in the city. The Mahist army and the Shilling army were not too different in ability. At least Long Yang was confident that 2 Shilling soldiers could definitely deal with 1 Mahist army. In this way they could at least wipe out half of the Mahist army in Bien City. Only then would the defending army behind be able to hold back the Mahist army. The soldier looked at Long Yang hesitantly and said, "But Crown Prince Genom of Gojoseon has already retreated with his troops." "What?" Long Yang suddenly stood up and the soldier quickly said, "Prince Genom of Gojoseon said that if we let the Mahist army enter the city, it will be too late. He has already led the remaining 100,000 soldiers and is preparing to withdraw from the west gate." Long Yang quickly walked out the door and said, "Idiot! There are still tens of thousands of Mahist army soldiers guarding the small town ahead. Where does he think he can retreat to?" But when Long Yang arrived at the west city, he could only see the Shilling army's horse hooves and smoke in the distance. Lei Tingfeng had brought along the Shilling army's most elite and most complete army of more than 100,000. The moment these men and horses withdrew, the originally sturdy defense instantly opened up a few large holes, and the Mo family army surged into the city like a tide. Under the west gate, Long Yang tiredly closed his eyes and sighed in a low voice, "Zhuyan, we are all finished." Although Lei Tingfeng took most of the people away, the Shilling soldiers were not just for show. It was already noon the next day when the Mahist army completely took over the entire Bien City. After a day and night of continuous fighting, even the Mo family army soldiers who were known for their bravery and fighting prowess were exhausted. Their eyes were bloodshot and their bodies were exhausted. When the Shilling defenders in the city were finally eliminated, the soldiers burst into cheers. Many people directly sat down on the street and fell asleep under the eaves. At noon the sun was shining brightly. Emo Xiuyao and his people just stepped into Bien City. Looking at the corpses of the 2 armies lying on the street, many soldiers on both sides of the street directly sat down and fell asleep. Emo Xiuyao waved his hand to stop the people around him who wanted to report loudly. As he walked past the corpses he asked in a low voice, "Where is Long Yang?" Zhuajing whispered, "Long Yang is in an empty house in the west of the city. There are already people guarding there. In addition, Long Yang has released many people in the city." Maybe it was because Emo Xiuyao said that he would bury all the people in the city with him. Yesterday night, Long Yang opened the gate of the west city and let many people out of the city. The Mahist army had strict military discipline. Although Emo Xiuyao said that he did not officially order a massacre in the city. So as long as the soldiers in the battle were not obstructed by ordinary people, they would not attack ordinary people. Last night about half of the people had escaped. Emo Xiuyao shook his head carelessly, "Let's go see Long Yang. How is the consort?" Zhuajing said, "Last night, Lei Tingfeng retreated with his people and fought with General Zhang in the west. He took about 20 to 30,000 people and rushed over. The consort ordered a pause in the pursuit. The army will reorganize in Bien City for 2 days. The consort should be back in a while." Hearing this, Emo Xiuyao's gloomy eyes flashed with a trace of warmth. He said lightly, "Order people to clean up the battlefield and let the soldiers rest. Go and bring Long Yang here." "Yes, Prince." Zhuajing received the order and left. Emo Xiuyao turned and went to the governor's mansion in Bien City. The governor's mansion had already been taken care of. Originally, the battle in the city did not affect the mansion too much. The civil officials in Bien City who had not yet escaped had been locked up here by the Mahist army. Seeing Emo Xiuyao come in, the West Hill officials all had different expressions. Some were begging, some were unyielding, some were fearful, and some were hostile. Emo Xiuyao did not have the heart to pay attention to them. He waved his hand and ordered people to take them away. Not long after he sat down to rest, the guard outside came in to report, "Prince Longyang is here." Emo Shuyao opened his eyes. They were filled with coldness. "Let him in." Not long after, Longyang strolled in. Zhuijing followed behind him but did not order people to hold him. Longyang was still dressed in white coarse clothes. He looked much older and more tired than he had a few days ago. At first glance he looked like an ordinary old man from the mountains. There was no trace of the ruthless look on his face when he used innocent people as meat shields on the city gate tower. Emo Shuyao looked at him calmly and said lightly, "General Fengde, nice to meet you." Chapter 668. Prince Ding, nice to meet you. Longyang hit the man in front of him for a long time before he finally spat out a few words. This was the first time Longyang had seen the world-famous Prince Ding. From a certain point of view, Emo Xuyao's fame was even greater than that of his father Emo Lufeng, who had made outstanding contributions to the Dechu state. Because he had done something that Prince Ding had never done in the past few generations of Prince Ding. That was to sever all ties with the Dechu state. From then on, the Mahist army and Prince Ding had truly become a power that contended for hegemony in this world. From then on, they had truly broken free from the shackles of the Dechu state. In the future, the success or failure of the Mahist army and the Dechu state would no longer have any relation. The man in front of him was dressed in snow-white clothes. His long white hair was casually draped over his shoulders. It was completely different from this bloody battlefield, but it made Longyang feel a trace of danger. Longyang believed in his intuition, even if he had not been on the battlefield for more than 20 years. The man in front of her was far from being as gentle as he appeared to be. Under the pure white snow of the sky and the white snow of the mountains, there was clearly a frightening stench of blood that surged. Emo Shuyao calmly looked at Longyang. He casually played with the blue and white porcelain cup in his hand as he lightly said, "Originally, I wanted to have a good chat with General Long and General Zhu. But General Long, I have to say, I's mood right now is very bad. General Long, do you know what I hate the most in my life?" Longyang looked at Emo Shuyao and said in a deep voice, "Prince Ding, please enlighten me." Emo Shuyao slowly put down the teacup. The sound of the teacup hitting the table echoed in the quiet room. "Is being threatened. What I hate the most in my life is being threatened by others. In addition, I am more curious as to why General I would give up on attacking the city for the sake of those people from Dechu state." Emo Shuyao slowly laughed as if he had said something funny. Longyang was silent for a moment before he said, "I was wrong. It was probably because, when one got old, one's heart would soften. If this old man was young, I would have made the same decision as Prince Ding." Emo Shuyao nodded and smiled. As expected, General Long is the one who understands I the best. If that's the case, is General Long prepared to accept the consequences of your decision? Hearing this, Longyang's expression changed and he said in a low voice, "Prince Ding, you've already taken down Bian City. Why do you still need to kill? This matter was done by this old man alone. If Prince Ding is angry, you might as well take this old man's life." Emo Shuyao smiled faintly and declined to comment. "I forgot to tell General Long that although General Long released most of the people in the city last night, but the Mahist army also captured many of the West Hill soldiers. Barely, it should be enough to make up for the number of people who escaped, right?" "Prince Ding?" Longyang painfully closed his eyes. "This old man will take responsibility for his own actions. Even if Prince Ding cuts this old man to pieces, this old man will not say a word. Please, let the innocent people and soldiers go." Emo Shuyao acted as if he didn't hear him. He waved to the people at the door and smiled. "Take General Longyang to see." Outside the door, Zhuijing waved his hand and 2 guards came in to take Longyang out. In the room, Emo Shuyao slowly closed his eyes. After a long time, a low voice slowly came out from under his long white hair. "These people are really annoying. Father, big brother, wait until I kill them all, then you can rest in peace, then no one will be able to hurt Li anymore." After Yi Li finished dealing with the matters on the battlefield, she brought Feng Zhiyao and the others back to Bian City. The Mahist army soldiers outside the city were sweeping the battlefield. There was a thick smell of blood in the air. A group of people walked on the streets of the city. From time to time, the soldiers who were cleaning the streets would come forward to salute them. Feng Zhiyao frowned and said with some confusion, "What is going on? Why is there not a single person in the city?" Even if the battle had just ended and the people were afraid to go out, it shouldn't be to the point where there was not a single person. Even the windows on the two sides of the street didn't have anyone peeking out. The entire city was quiet. Other than the soldiers who were cleaning the streets, it was like a dead city. The soldier in front hesitated and looked at Yi Li and the others before reporting. Reporting to Wang Fei, General Feng, Prince just ordered all the people and prisoners to be taken to the west side of the city. Yi Li frowned and asked, taken to the west side of the city? What for? Outside the west side of the city is the execution ground of Bian City. Execution ground? Feng Jiao thought for a while and said, which important general of West Hill has been captured? Long Yang or Lei Tingfeng? That's not right. Even if they were captured, there is no need to rush to execute them now, right? Killing Long Yang was not a big deal. It would be a blow to West Hill's morale. But Lei Tingfeng's identity was more valuable alive than dead. Young Master Feng felt dizzy and forgot that Lei Tingfeng had just slipped away from his hands last night. The soldier looked at Yi Li and didn't say anything. Yi Li frowned and said, tell me the truth. The soldier said in a low voice, Prince ordered all the prisoners and people of Bian City to be killed. What? Yi Li and Feng Jiao were both shocked. They looked at each other. Feng Jiao steadied his mind and asked, what is going on? The soldier quickly explained the situation of the battle. Of course, it also included how Long Yang threatened them with the people of Dechu State in Bian City to withdraw their troops. They didn't have time to finish listening. The group hurried to the execution ground outside the west side of the city. There was a large open area outside the west side of the city. It had been the execution ground since Bian City was built. But there was no doubt that the number of people who would be beheaded here today would be more than the total number of people in Bian City in the past few hundred years. Long Yang was held down by two Qilin soldiers. He faced the execution ground and looked helplessly at the prisoners who were forced to kneel on the ground. Many of these people were still injured. But at this time they were forced to kneel on the ground and stick out their necks. The flat and cold bluestone ground was already stained with dark red blood. Obviously the people kneeling now were not the first batch. Long Yang was held down by the people behind him and couldn't move. His eyes were about to pop out. Enough. Prince Ding. Enough. It's all this old man's fault. Kill me now. Long Yang's eyes were red and the veins on his forehead popped out. He was really wrong. In order to protect Bian City, he had unintentionally angered a bloodthirsty lion that had been dormant for many years. Perhaps it was because he had killed too many people when he was young that he decided to take revenge on these innocent soldiers and people in his old age. Prince Ding. Kill this old man. Long Yang roared. Mo Xiuyao's lips curled into a smile. He raised his hand and pointed at the people in the pool of blood. I won't kill you. General Long Yang, just watch. Look at these soldiers and how these people died. It was you who caused their deaths. When two armies fight, I never bring harm to the people. This time you forced I. After this, I believe that yesterday's situation will never happen again on the battlefield. Don't you think so? Killing innocent people like this, aren't you afraid of retribution? Long Yang said in pain. If it was in the past, Long Yang didn't believe in retribution. He only believed that man could conquer nature. But now, he had to admit that there was retribution in this world. Chapter 669. Mo Xiuyao raised an eyebrow and laughed lightly. What retribution is I afraid of? The Prince Ding mansion has served the country loyally for generations. What good retribution have they received? Are Wang Fei and Shi Ziyi not afraid? Long Yang said. When these words were said, Mo Xiuyao's frown instantly froze. Mo Xiuyao suddenly looked at Long Yang. That blood-filled gaze caused Long Yang's heart to tremble. He heard Mo Xiuyao say harshly, kill them? Turning back to look at Long Yang, Mo Xiuyao said coldly, you better pray that Li Li will be safe for the rest of her life, otherwise, I will bury all the people in this world with her. Hearing Mo Xiuyao's order, the executioners on the execution ground once again raised the knives in their hands. Stop! A clear female voice came from behind. Everyone's hands paused. They saw a white-robed figure land in the middle of the execution ground like a white cloud. Yi Li turned to look at the dark red blood at her feet and frowned. Then she looked at the sobbing commoners who had been brought to the execution ground and sighed in relief. There was still time. Li Li, why have you come? Mo Xiuyao stilled and his cold face warmed. He stood up and asked gently as he looked at the white-robed figure on the execution ground. Yi Li raised her eyes and looked at the man with snow-white robes and snow-white hair on the high platform. Her handsome face had a faint warmth and gentleness. It was completely different from the cold and emotionless voice that sounded like an Azura. She led Feng Jiao onto the high platform. Feng Jiao was the first to experience his prince's knife-like gaze. He helplessly rubbed his nose and stood to the side. Wang Fei had come back at this time. It had nothing to do with him. Lily, why have you come? Why don't you go back and rest after working so hard for so many days? Mo Xiaoyao asked unhappily when he saw the tiredness on Yi Li's face. Yi Li helplessly rolled her eyes at him. Who was the one who caused her to not be able to go back to rest? What's going on? Why did you suddenly? Yi Li asked in a low voice. If possible, she didn't want to ask Mo Xiaoyao about it in this place. But now was not the time to choose a place for her. If he hesitated, the heads of nearly 100,000 people would roll. In both her past and present life, Yi Li was still a soldier. She was not afraid of war, nor was she afraid of death. However, killing prisoners and innocent civilians was clearly not within her moral bottom line. Moreover, this would damage the reputation of Mo Xiaoyao and the Mahist army. A few years ago, Mo Xiaoyao had killed thousands of Dechu state soldiers in the northwest. This had already caused many scholars to criticize him. If the citizens of the city were added, then it really wasn't a good thing for Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao slightly knit his brows and said in a low voice, Li, you don't need to care about these things. Go back and rest first, okay? When I finish dealing with these things, I will go back to accompany you. We can rest in Bian City for 2 days. Xiaoyao. Facing Mo Xiaoyao's obvious desire to change the topic, Yi Li quietly looked at him with a trace of worry in her eyes. Xiaoyao, I'm a bit tired. Can you accompany me back to rest first? We can talk about these things another day. Yi Li said softly. Her voice was weak and tired. Mo Xiaoyao's heart softened. He lowered his head and looked at Yi Li's dark eyes. Finally he bent down and picked up Yi Li and walked out. Yi Li leaned into Mo Xiaoyao's arms and raised her head to give Feng Jiao a meaningful look. Feng Jiao nodded slightly, indicating that she would leave it to him. Only then did he rest assured and close his eyes against Mo Xiaoyao. She really was a bit tired after these few days. Mo Xiaoyao carried Yi Li past the execution ground. His gaze lightly swept over the kneeling West Hill soldiers. A trace of disdain and ridicule flashed through his cold eyes. Among these West Hill soldiers, there was no lack of staunch and unyielding people. After being defeated and captured, they were already prepared to die. Now that they saw Mo Xiaoyao's mocking gaze, how could they endure it? One of them fiercely spat and sneered, surnamed Mo, if you want to kill me, then kill me. 20 years later, I will be a good man again. I will definitely slaughter everyone in your Prince Ding mansion. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes were cold. He said lightly, since that is the case, I will fulfill your wish. Kill them all. After that, he no longer paid attention to the people in front of him. Carrying Yi Li, he strolled out of the execution ground. The people who stayed behind looked at each other. The Wang Fei clearly meant that they were not allowed to kill, but the prince wanted them all to be killed. To kill or not to kill became a problem. Logically speaking, they should naturally listen to the prince's orders. But in these years, the prince had never gone against the Wang Fei's wishes. Furthermore, the soldiers of the Mo family army were the most elite soldiers, and every one of them had the pride of a soldier. Killing people on the battlefield was one thing. They really could not bear to slaughter ordinary people who had no power to resist. General Feng, what should we do? The general supervising the execution came forward and asked. Feng Jiao touched his chin and pondered for a moment. He used his chin to point at the group of people who were still kneeling on the execution ground and said, kill them all. Leave the rest for now. The prince said to kill them all. Those who insulted and cursed Prince Ding deserved to die. But the 100 people who were with him were pitiful. They could only think of it as their bad luck. Those kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. As for the rest, of course they would have to wait for the Prince's Wang Fei's orders. Feng Jiao thought silently. The general supervising the execution satisfied and went to carry out the order. Feng Jiao looked at the ashen-faced Long Yang and secretly shook his head. Long Yang had also violated Mo Xiaoyao's taboo. He had used the people of Dechu state as meat shields. If Mo Xiaoyao retreated once, the West Hill generals behind him would follow suit. More importantly, there were nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first. If Mo Xiaoyao really gave the order to retreat, Long Yang would free up his hands and the nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first would suffer. But, wasn't His Highness a little too angry? Yi Li woke up from a deep sleep. It was already dark outside. She sat up and rubbed her eyebrows. Something was wrong. Although she was very tired, it was not to the extent that she would fall asleep right after being held in Mo Xiaoyao's arms. She suddenly remembered what had happened at the execution ground. Yili looked up and saw Emo Xiaoyao sitting under the lamp outside the gauze screen, writing. As if he had heard Yi Li's figure, Emo Xiaoyao put down his pen and walked into the room. He smiled and said, "You're awake?" Yi Li nodded and looked at Emo Xiaoyao carefully. Under the light of the night pearl, his handsome face had a faint smile, gentle and comfortable. Yi Li leaned into his arms and looked up at his tired face. She said softly, "Why don't you rest for a while? Aren't we going to stay in Bien City for 2 days? If there's anything we can deal with it tomorrow." Emo Xiaoyao rested his chin on her head. He stroked her soft hair and smiled faintly. "I can't sleep. I'll deal with everything I need to deal with so that I can accompany you tomorrow. Li, you've worked hard these days." For some reason, Yi Li suddenly remembered Zhu Ling's expression before he died. His white clothes were stained with blood, lying on the ground stained with blood. His eyes were dim. The smile on her face gradually faded. Yi Li closed her eyes with a headache. "What's wrong, Li?" Emo Xiaoyao asked softly. Chapter 670. "It's nothing," Yi Li said in a low voice. "I'm just a little tired." Emo Xiaoyao's eyes moved slightly. He gently patted her delicate back and said in a gentle voice, "Since you're tired, then sleep a little longer. Let's talk about it tomorrow, okay?" Yi Li nodded. Leaning against Emo Xiaoyao's chest really did make her feel a little drowsy. Forcing herself to stay awake, Yi Li said in a low voice, "Xiaoyao, the war has nothing to do with the people. Don't kill the innocent, the people's hearts." Emo Xiaoyao lowered his head and looked at the beautiful face that was gradually falling into a deep sleep. He lowered his head and gently kissed her. "Li's heart is too soft. This is not good. It will be very easy for others to hurt you. Innocent? Who in this world is innocent?" In the temporary study of the governor's office, Emo Xiaoyao sat in a chair. His expression was indifferent as he looked at Feng Zhiyao and Qin Feng in front of him. Feng Zhiyao felt extremely helpless in his heart. However, he did not dare to provoke Emo Xiaoyao when his mood was obviously very bad. The originally lazy and leisurely smile on his face gradually became a stiff fake smile. In the end, he could not maintain it any longer. Looking at Qin Feng, who clearly had no intention of speaking, Feng Zhiyao coughed lightly and said, "Prince." Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyes and looked at him indifferently. He asked, "Have you finished dealing with the people on the execution ground?" "It's done," Feng Zhiyao quickly replied. "Finished?" Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly. "Then what are the people in the captive camp outside the city?" Feng Zhiyao smiled apologetically and said, "The person who insulted Prince and the person who was kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. Prince is very clear. As for the rest, didn't Prince not give any orders?" Emo Xiaoyao tilted his head and looked at him with a half-smile. He asked, "Then I will give the order now. Go and kill them all." "Prince." Feng Zhiyao's face was bitter as he whispered, "Prince, please reconsider." Emo Xiaoyao looked at him coldly. Feng Zhiyao continued, "Prince, our Mahist army has strict military discipline. We never kill innocent people. If the prince killed these people in a fit of anger, the reputation of the Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion would be ruined. Moreover, the people of West Hill were brave. If they knew that the Mahist army had massacred the city, they would definitely help the defenders of West Hill to defend the city. It will also be very disadvantageous for our future battles." Looking at Emo Xiaoyao's unmoved appearance, Feng Zhiyao sighed in his heart. He could only continue, "Moreover, the consort is kind and will not agree with the prince's actions. Why would the prince make the consort unhappy for irrelevant people?" At this point, Feng Zhiyao raised his eyes and stole a glance at Emo Xiaoyao. Seeing that he was frowning and thinking, Feng Zhiyao was slightly relieved. If the prince did not care and insisted on killing those people, then no one would be able to persuade him. After a long while, Emo Xiaoyao said coldly, "Kill all the captives and drive all the ordinary people out of the city. Feng-san, if you do not do it well, then do as you see fit." Feng Zhiyao sighed in relief. In this era, there was no such thing as not killing captives. Captives captured on the battlefield could only be exchanged or used as slaves. Otherwise they were usually killed. Although Feng Zhiyao did not care to kill the defenseless West Hill soldiers, he knew that these people could not be released. It would be troublesome to keep them alive. If Emo Xiaoyao insisted on killing them, then he did not care. "Yes, sir," Feng Zhiyao said respectfully. Looking at Emo Xiaoyao, he asked, "Prince Long Yang, how should we deal with him?" Emo Xiaoyao's face darkened at the mention of Long Yang. With a gloomy expression, he said, "Take Long Yang to the execution ground. Let him see how those West Hill soldiers die." Feng Jiao finally understood why Long Yang had appeared at the execution platform during the day. He shook his head in his heart. Long Yang had offended the prince too much. No one could persuade him. "Yes, sir. Go and do it now. Don't let the consort know," Emo Xiuyao added slowly. Feng Jiao and Qin Feng looked at each other. This kind of thing, could they hide it? Yes, sir. After finishing, Emo Xiuyao had no intention of letting them leave. For a moment the two were confused. Emo Xiuyao stared at the two for a long time before asking, "What happened to Emo Xiuyao?" The two were stunned and did not understand what Emo Xiuyao meant. Emo Xiuyao frowned and said irritably, "Li has been in a bad mood. What happened this time? The consort was in a bad mood?" The two lowered their brows and thought for a moment. They could not think of anything that made the consort in a bad mood. The war had always been going smoothly. Although the Mo family army had suffered some losses, those were all unavoidable losses that were expected. Other than that, there wasn't much else. Seeing Mo Xiuyao's face getting worse and worse, Qin Feng said, "Zhu Ling, the grandson of General Zhu Yan, blocked a hidden weapon for the consort and died. General Zhu Yan jumped down from the tower in front of the consort and committed suicide." Qin Feng thought for a long time. Only these two things could be called special. "Zhu Ling? Who is that?" Mo Xiuyao asked. Qin Feng told the story from beginning to end. Originally, Yi Li and Qin Feng only went to help Zhang Qilan deal with Zhu Yan who might come out and the Jing Guojun who was hiding in an unknown place. After that, the matter of Yi Li, Lin Han and Lin Han sneaking into the Jinghua army's base alone was suddenly decided by Yi Li. She didn't tell Mo Xiuyao, so he naturally didn't know. The more he listened, the more gloomy Mo Xiuyao's face became. Feng Jiao, who was standing next to him, could not help but take 2 steps back. When Qin Feng finished, the study was silent. Feng Jiao bitterly waited for Mo Xiuyao's predictable anger to hit. After waiting for a long time, he heard Mo Xiuyao's calm voice. "I know. You can go out." Feng Jiao was stunned. Qin Feng glanced at him coldly and turned to go out. Feng Jiao trembled and hurriedly rushed out as well. In the study, only Mo Xiuyao was left alone, facing the lonely lamp on the table. "Zhu Ling, a dead person still makes Li upset. He died too easily." Chapter 671. Early in the morning, Bian City had already returned to its usual peaceful and leisurely state, but it was no longer as bustling and noisy as before. Other than the patrolling Mahist army soldiers, the streets were empty. There were no noisy people or vendors, no open shops or restaurants on both sides of the street. The huge Bian City seemed incomparably quiet and empty. Mo Xiuyao had been invited to the study by Zhang Qilan and the others early in the morning. Yi Li took advantage of the free time to take Zhuojing, Lin Han, and Qin Feng to walk around the city. Looking at the empty streets, she was silent for a moment before asking, "Yesterday those people on the execution ground?" Qin Feng and the others looked at each other. Qin Feng said, reporting to Wang Fei, "Prince has ordered all the citizens to be expelled from Bian City." Hearing this, Yi Li let out a sigh of relief. No matter what, it was good that the city wasn't massacred. "Expelled from Bian City? Where did those people go?" Yi Li asked after thinking about it. Qin Feng said, "They managed to keep their lives, so it's good to go anywhere. But Lei Tingfeng's army has been defeated and only 20 to 30,000 people are retreating to the west. Those citizens are also going in that direction. I'm afraid that many of them will be incorporated into Lei Tingfeng's army. When the time comes when they go to the battlefield." Yi Li said lightly, "When they go to the battlefield they are the enemy. Spread the news that Long Yang used to choose state citizens as meat shields at the top of Bian City. It doesn't matter if the news is exaggerated." The three looked at Yi Li in confusion. Yi Li said, "The matter of the prisoners and the prince wanting to kill the citizens cannot be hidden. With this reason, it will be better for the prince and the Mahist army's reputation. Once the news of Long Yang using Dechu state citizens as meat shields spread, Mo Xiuyao's actions would be easier to understand. Whether it was revenge or a moment of anger, it was fine. It was easy for people to overlook Mo Xiuyao's actions. Besides, Prince Ding didn't massacre the entire city in the end." Zhuojing answered and went to handle the matter. Yi Li continued to walk forward with Qin Feng and Lin Han. "Where is Long Yang?" Qin Feng hesitated for a moment, then said, "It's in the prison on the west side of the city. Prince ordered a large number of soldiers to guard it." Let's go take a look, Yi Li said softly. Mo Shuyao really hated Long Yang. The place where Long Yang was locked up was not a sturdy prison. Instead, it was a small building facing the execution ground in the western part of the city. From the window of the small building, one could see the execution ground outside the city. No one knew how many people had been killed in the execution ground outside the city last night. But Long Yang definitely knew, because he was forced to watch the captives die one by one from the beginning to the end. Even after the execution, Mo Shuyao found him a prison cell that didn't face the execution ground. The smell of blood from the execution ground could probably be smelled all night. The soldiers guarding the building didn't stop Yi Li. Yi Li waved her hand to stop the others from following. Only Qin Feng and Lin Han stepped into the small building. They hadn't seen each other for one night, but Long Yang was completely different from yesterday. Long Yang, who was already 70 years old, finally bent his back, which was still healthy and strong, down. The frown on his face had deepened overnight. At a glance, it was as if he had aged more than 10 years. His sparse white hair was scattered messily on his head. His old, turbid eyes were dim and lifeless. Anyone could see that Long Yang was in great pain. His pain had nothing to do with his body. It was his heart that was tormented by guilt and regret. He was already an old man in his 70s. He was no longer as cold-hearted and murderous as he was when he was young. Seeing the soldiers of Xiling die one by one because of his mistakes, he hated that he couldn't take their place. Cough cough. Princess Ding? Hearing the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, Long Yang turned around with some difficulty. He saw a young woman standing at the top of the stairs. A beautiful woman in a green dress. She didn't have the aura of pearls and jade, nor did she have the grace and nobility of brocade. Her beautiful face was calm, but there was a kind of majesty that ordinary ladies and noble women couldn't compare to. Long Yang didn't expect that the world-famous Princess Ding would be a young woman who wasn't even 20 years old. But in a place like Bian City, a woman who could come and go freely and with such an aura could only be the king's consort. Yi Li nodded and said softly, "General Long Yang, nice to meet you." Long Yang smiled bitterly. How can it be nice to meet a defeated general? Yesterday, thank you for saving the lives of the people of Bian City. I didn't do it for the people of Bian City. Yi Li walked to a chair not far from Long Yang and sat down. Long Yang shook his head and said, "No matter what, it's a fact that consort saved them. This old man. Old madam is muddle-headed and almost killed these innocent people. This old man naturally has to thank consort." Saying this, Long Yang stood up and bowed to Yi Li. He was already a person who was about to die, so he didn't care much about fame and fortune. He didn't feel that it was shameful to bow to a young woman in her early 20s. Yi Li was startled. She glanced at Qin Feng and Zhu Jing, who were standing to the side. The two of them hurriedly came forward and helped Long Yang to his left and right, sending him back to the chair he had been sitting in. Long Yang sat down to catch his breath. Then he looked at Yi Li and said, "For consort to come at this time, is there something you want to say to this old man?" Long Yang's spirit and physical strength were very poor. Not only was he tired these days, but he also spent the whole night looking out of the window at the execution ground. The 70-year-old man was exhausted to the extreme. Even if the Mahist army didn't hurt Long Yang and didn't even eat the slightest bit of food, Long Yang's face and body still became extremely weak. Yi Li nodded and pondered for a moment before saying, "General Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling have died in the battle." Long Yang smiled helplessly and said, "This? I have already expected this. Zhu Yan has been copying people's hearts all his life. After 20 years of suffocation, it's a good thing for him to die on the battlefield. He is luckier than me. It's just a pity for Zhu Ling. That boy was thrown into the Jingwa army by his grandfather when he was just 10 years old. After more than 10 years of hard work, he took over the command of the Jingwa army, but I didn't expect." Shaking his head and sighing, Long Yang looked at Yi Li and said, "I heard that consort defeated Lei Tingfeng's hundreds of thousands of troops by yourself. We thought that Lei Tingfeng was used to being arrogant, so he was defeated. Now it seems that I am the arrogant one. Consort is no worse than a famous general. I admire you for being able to find the Jingwa army in just a few days. It's just a small trick. General, you flatter me." After a moment of silence in the small building, Long Yang asked, "How did Zhu Yan die?" "General Zhu died for his country after the city was broken." Yi Li whispered, "Well, he died for a good reason." Long Yang nodded. Looking at Yi Li, he said, "In fact, even if consort didn't come today, I still wanted to see consort." Yi Li said in a low voice, General Long Yang, if you have anything to say, just say it. Long Yang sighed and looked out of the window at the empty execution ground not far away. He said, Consort must have heard that when I was young, I was also a cruel and merciless person who killed without blinking an eye. Yi Li nodded and said, yes, General Long Yang's name is not only famous in the western region, but also in the Central Plains. Chapter 672. Long Yang shook his head. What killing god of the West? When I was young I didn't believe in the heavens, gods or fate. I killed many people. Now that I've been idle for more than 20 years I know my mistakes. However, I never thought that this old man's sins of killing would actually be reflected in my old age. This old man lost his wife in his middle age, and in his later years he was all alone without any children. There must be some reasons. Yi Li was silent for a moment. She looked up at Long Yang and said, I understand General Long Yang's meaning. Long Yang nodded, although I'm old I still have a good eye for people. Wang Fei has a peaceful nature and is not a bloodthirsty person. But Prince Ding, although I've only met him a few times, Prince Ding's brows seem calm and indifferent. In fact, his brows are like knives and his eyes are filled with killing intent. I'm afraid it's not a good omen. I heard that Wang Fei came from a famous scholarly family in Dechu State. You should know that war between two armies is inevitable. But wantonly killing innocent people is against the harmony of the heavens. Yi Li frowned. There was some displeasure in her eyes. She said lightly, General Long, Prince Ding didn't hurt anyone in Bian City. Looking at Yi Li's displeasure, Long Yang smiled and nodded, that's why I have to thank Wang Fei. If it weren't for Wang Fei, I'm afraid that Bian City would be covered in rivers of blood right now. Yi Li frowned and asked, what does General Long Yang want to say to me? Long Yang looked at Yi Li and said in a low voice, Wang Fei, please advise Prince Ding. The number of casualties on the battlefield is the will of the heavens. But killing innocent people outside of the battlefield is what a ruler should do. Yi Li's heart moved slightly. She looked at Long Yang calmly. Long Yang looked out the window with a disappointed expression. When a person is about to die, his words are kind. I'm not saying this for Xiling. It's purely what I've gained in half my life. If he allowed the blood to cover his eyes, there would be a day when his heart would be covered by the blood. Since ancient times, the battlefield has been a place that can turn living people into ghosts. Yi Li lowered her eyes, but her mind was in a mess. She understood what Long Yang meant. The battlefield was indeed a place where it was easy to magnify one's evil thoughts to the maximum. Yi Li had always known that Mo Xiuyao was not what he appeared to be. Whether it was the initial gentleness and elegance, or the indifference and coldness. Or was it the occasional willful mischief that came later, carefree and unrestrained? How could a person who had suffered such a heavy blow and hurt, who had endured humiliation for so many years, and whose personality had completely changed, be so calm? At least, if it was her, she wouldn't be able to do it. Mo Xiuyao had hatred in his heart, but he was able to suppress it. His heart was filled with hatred, but he could only watch as Mo Jingqi died in front of him. He didn't do anything to take revenge. This made it easy for people to think that his hatred was not deep, or that he had gradually opened up his mind. But Yi Li knew that Mo Xiuyao had never been a broad-minded person who would repay evil with good. This time, Mo Xiuyao's sudden outburst was actually unreasonable. Long Yang's action of using the people of Dechu State as meat shields was wrong. But if it was a normal person, they would have caught Long Yang and cut him into pieces to vent their anger. But Mo Xiuyao wanted Long Yang to live. He wanted to see the West Hill soldiers and even the West Hill people die one by one. He wanted Long Yang to live a life worse than death. He wasn't angry at Long Yang's actions, but he hated Long Yang and extreme hatred. But in reality, there was no hatred between Long Yang and Mo Xiuyao. There was no hatred in a fight on the battlefield. Long Yang could see all this, so Yi Li could naturally understand. So Long Yang was regretting. He didn't really regret using the people as meat shields. He regretted that his actions had drawn out Mo Xiuyao's murderous intent, and even possibly unleashed a bloodthirsty demon. Yi Li looked at the old man in front of her, whose eyes were filled with worry. She said seriously, he won't become that kind of person. He will be very good. Long Yang nodded and said, this old man believes that Princess can do it. To have Princess Ding as his wife is Prince Ding's fortune. Yi Li smiled sweetly and said softly, to be able to meet him is also my fortune. It didn't matter who was whose fortune. But Yi Li believed that Mo Xiuyao was the right person for her. Even if there were people in the world more handsome than Mo Xiuyao, more powerful and more capable than Emo Xiuyao? There was only one Emo Xiuyao. At this point the two of them looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere in the small building was so peaceful that it didn't seem like it was between the two sides. Yili was about to speak when the sound of steady footsteps came from downstairs. Qin Feng, who was standing at the top of the stairs, looked downstairs and gestured to Yili. Yili stood up and walked to the top of the stairs. The person downstairs had already come up. Seeing Yili, he was slightly startled. He smiled and said, "Li." Yili reached out and grasped Emo Xiuyao's hand, pulling him into the small building. She smiled and said, "Why are you here?" Emo Xiuyao lowered his head to look at her and said softly, "After dealing with official business, I wanted to take you out for a walk. They said you came out." Yili smiled and said, "I had nothing to do this morning so I came out for a walk. I also wanted to pay a visit to General Long. You've been busy so early in the morning. Why don't you sit down and rest for a while?" Seeing Long Yang sitting by the window, Emo Xiuyao's half-closed eyes flashed with a trace of coldness. However, he didn't have any intention of disobeying Yili. He allowed her to pull him to sit down next to her. The two of them, who couldn't wait to kill each other yesterday, sat together. Naturally, there was nothing to talk about. Emo Xiuyao also didn't have any intention of talking to Long Yang. He just acted as if he didn't exist. He pulled Yili's hand and asked softly, "Li, do you have any place you want to go? We'll be leaving in 2 days. I heard that there are a few places in Bian City that are really worth seeing." Yili smiled and said, "Whatever place you think is good, we'll go take a look. If I remember correctly, Longshan Academy is in the city?" Emo Xiuyao frowned slightly. He nodded with some displeasure and said, "That's right. It's a pity that several of the famous teachers of Longshan Academy were taken away by Lei Tingfeng. They only left behind a few scholars. They said that they didn't have time to take away some ancient books. Lily can take a look and see if there's anything you like. Later on, you can have someone send it back to grandfather and uncles." Yili smiled and said, "You're still the most considerate. However, just pick a few that grandfather and uncles will like. The rest will be left in Bian City. They'll be useful in the future." Of course, it wasn't to return them to the people of Longshan Academy. Since the Mahist army had occupied Bian City, if they wanted to rule for a long time, it was impossible for them to not have people. Although Emo Xiuyao had expelled all the people of Bian City, there would still be people here in the future. Longshan Academy was one of the 3 great academies in the world. If it was restored, it would be very beneficial for the Prince Ding Mansion's rule. Emo Xiuyao naturally understood Yili's meaning. He smiled and said, "Whatever Lili says is fine. However, if Lili is interested in Longshan Academy, there's still one person in Bian City. I'll have someone bring her to see Lili later." Yili was somewhat helpless. What did he mean by she was interested in Longshan Academy? However, she was somewhat interested in Emo Xiuyao's words. She raised her eyebrows and asked, "Which madam of Longshan Academy has stayed in Bian City and hasn't left?" Chapter 673. Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Longshan Academy's headmaster, Mr. Xiuding, Qin Xiufu. Hearing this, not only Yili but even Long Yang showed a trace of surprise. Mr. Xiuding's name was far less famous than Mr. Qingyun and the Su family, but this did not mean that Mr. Xiuding's talent was inferior to Mr. Qingyun's. But compared to Dechu State, Xiling had always valued martial prowess and despised literature. There were not as many literati as Dechu State, and the status of literati was not as high as Dechu State's. And this Mr. Xiuding indeed did not involve himself in politics. He only focused on teaching and educating people. Xiling, in the eyes of the people of the Central Plains, was not much different from Nanzhao and Beirong, but it was able to make Longshan Academy one of the 3 great academies. This was enough to prove Mr. Xiuding's talent and knowledge. Longshan Academy and Lishan Academy had different ancient legacies. Longshan Academy had been developed by Mr. Xiuding. Why is this Mr. Xiuding still in Bian City? Why is he still here? Yili asked curiously. Emo Xiuyao nodded and smiled. Of course. Even if he really wanted to kill everyone in Bian City, he had not really lost his mind. He knew what kind of people he could not kill or let go. And in this Bian City, there were only a few people with such value. Before Bian City had been conquered, Emo Xiuyao had already ordered Qi Lin to control them. Even if they left first, they could not leave. "Shall we go and take a look?" Emo Xiuyao asked softly. "I heard that Mr. Xiuding is quite troublesome." Yili also stood up. They would not stay in Bien City for long, so naturally they had to seize the time to take a look. Emo Xiaoyao let go of Yi Li's hand and smiled. I still have a few words to say to General Long Yang. Can Miss Li go down and wait for me? Yi Li glanced at Long Yang, who was sitting by the window. She nodded and said softly, I'll wait for you downstairs. Emo Xiaoyao only turned to look at Long Yang through the window when the footsteps had completely disappeared. The gentle smile on his face had long disappeared without a trace, and his gloomy eyes were filled with a sharp and murderous aura. If I hear you talking nonsense with Li Li again, I will definitely make you regret it. Although he didn't hear what Long Yang said to Ali, the worry that flashed across Ali's eyes when he came up didn't escape Emo Xiaoyao's eyes. Long Yang must have said something to Li Li that he shouldn't have said, which made Li Li worried about him. Long Yang looked calmly at him without the heart-wrenching pain and hatred from yesterday. He smiled faintly and said, Prince Ding is very fortunate to have such a Wang Fei. Emo Xiaoyao snorted coldly and stared darkly at him. Long Yang shook his head and said with a smile, Prince, don't worry. What can this old man say to Wang Fei? It's just a casual chat. Also, we don't have to see each other again. Speaking of this, Long Yang sighed with melancholy. Emo Xiaoyao stared at Long Yang for a moment and then suddenly laughed in a low voice. Long Yang, don't count on Enchanting coming back. Even if he comes back, he can't save Xiling. I have 400,000 soldiers waiting for him at the border. There are also the hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers from Nanzhao. Do you think those soldiers have the time to come back? And the small countries of the western regions that you suppressed in the past, do you think they will take this chance to take revenge? Xiling is hopeless. Long Yang was stunned and only recovered after a while. He finally laughed helplessly, but his laughter was incomparably bleak and dispirited. As expected of Prince Ding, years of planning, as expected, it's fine if you don't act, but once you act, it's extraordinary. Forget it, this old man is old and should die. In the future, this old man will not care. Prince Ding, please. Outside the door downstairs, seeing Emo Xiaoyao stroll out, Yi Li smiled and went up to greet him. Emo Xiaoyao wrapped an arm around her slender waist and said in a low voice, Are we going to visit Sir Xiaoding now? Yi Li blinked and asked worriedly, Sir Xiaoding really won't chase us out? Scholars always had some pride in their bones. With Emo Xiaoyao's actions in Bien City, Yi Li would not be surprised if Sir Xiaoding directly charged at them with a knife, much less chase them out. Emo Xiaoyao snorted and walked forward with Yi Li. Who dares? Yi Li turned her head to glance at the small building with the windows still open and asked, What did you say to General Long Yang? What do you plan to do with him? Emo Xiaoyao's eyes flashed slightly and he smiled faintly. Tell him not to speak nonsense to Li in the future. Li does not need to worry about me. Yi Li was startled and reached out to take the hand around her waist. She said softly, I'm not worried. No matter what, we will be together. Emo Xiaoyao's expression relaxed and the smile on his face became even warmer. Li, do not worry. I have no interest in arguing with a half-dead old man. As long as he does not make a fuss, I will ignore him. Yi Li smiled faintly. In my eyes, are you not more important than him? Xiaoyao, I do not care how you deal with him. As a soldier, Long Yang's devotion to the country was indeed worthy of her admiration. However, Long Yang's body was riddled with blood debts. Coupled with his actions in Bien City, even if Emo Xiaoyao sentenced him to death, she wouldn't say anything. The fall of a famous general was a pity, but Long Yang was not innocent. The two walked further and further away until a soldier caught up from behind. With a panting voice he said, Prince Wang Fei. Long Yang set himself on fire. Yi Li was startled. What happened? Turning her head, they could no longer see the small room where Long Yang was imprisoned. But they could still see the thick smoke in that direction. The soldier paused and said, General Long Yang poured wine on himself and set himself on fire. Chapter 674. Hearing the soldier's report, Yi Li was stunned for a while. It was not until Emo Xiaoyao raised his hand to touch her that she came back to her senses. Li Li? Emo Xiaoyao looked down at his calm wife in his arms and frowned slightly. Yi Li shook her head and sighed softly. After Zhu Yan's death, another old general committed suicide in front of her. Rationally and emotionally she could understand their choice. Because if it were her, she would not surrender to the enemy. The two old generals were loyal to the West Hill all their lives, and they died to protect their reputation. Whether it was the enemy or friend, they could only respect their strength of character. But Yili faintly felt that she could not stand it anymore. Perhaps she had seen too many deaths these days? Lily, what's wrong with you? Are you not feeling well? Emo Xiaoyao asked worriedly as he supported her. Let's go back first, we can talk about other things tomorrow. Yili held his hand and shook her head. She smiled reassuringly and said, I'm fine, we don't have much time to stay in Bian City. Pass down my order, bury General Long Yang with the general's rights. Just bury him with General Zhu Yan. Emo Xiaoyao nodded and ordered, do as Princess said. Go. The soldier took the order and left. Emo Xiaoyao waved his hand to let the people behind him leave. Holding Yi Li's hand, he walked slowly with one hand on her waist and whispered, Long Yang and Zhu Yan are dead, Lili is sad? Yi Li shook her head and said, I don't know what's wrong, maybe the two old generals are too old. They are over 70 years old, but it's inevitable that they feel a little emotional. Emo Xiaoyao whispered, if Lili is sad, stay in the army and don't worry about these things. Yi Li smiled and said, does Prince really think that I am a delicate flower that cannot be blown by the wind? No matter what, the two old generals were loyal to the country. Now that they're dead. Emo Xiaoyao said, do you think I'll bother with the dead? If Mr. Li said to give him a grand funeral, then he would give him a grand funeral. Lili, don't be sad for others, okay? Hearing Emo Xiaoyao's low voice, Yi Li raised her head to look at his eyes. She couldn't help but smile. She raised her hand and gently touched his slightly furrowed brows. In this world, you, little Bao, grandfather, and uncle are the most important people to me. Apart from you, no one can truly make me sad. So, Xiaoyao, you must do well. Of course I will. And Xiaobao. I will protect all the people Lili likes. I will definitely not make Lili sad. So, Lili, don't pay attention to those irrelevant people, okay? Emo Xiaoyao said in a low voice. Yili blinked. She looked at Emo Xiaoyao seriously and raised her eyebrows. Irrelevant people? Isn't Lili sad about Zhu Ling's death? Emo Xiaoyao asked in a low voice. But Yi Li could still hear the anger in his voice when he said Zhu Ling's name. Zhu Ling ah. Yi Li sighed softly and said, I just feel that he is still very young. Also, my plan this time is not very open and aboveboard. Of course, she knew that this was not all. Yi Li was not someone who was slow in her emotions. She understood Zhu Ling's feelings. However, not to mention that she and Zhu Ling had only just met, not to mention their positions. In Yi Li's heart, there would never be another man more important than Emo Xiaoyao. From the beginning, it was destined that this was impossible. She felt guilty because of Zhu Ling, not because she had any feelings for Zhu Ling. It was purely because she had let down a sincere heart. But there was no need to let Emo Xiaoyao know about the rest. Between husband and wife, it wasn't wrong to occasionally lie with white intentions. Li didn't do anything wrong. If he saw any flaws, he would have killed Li. Emo Xiaoyao ground his teeth and said, but Li can't do these things secretly anymore. What if something happens? If you really need women, you can just have Qin Feng and the others train a few. I know. Yi Li silently rolled her eyes. She knew it would be like this. After confirming that Yi Li seriously agreed, Emo Xiaoyao nodded in satisfaction. He held Yi Li's hand and walked forward. Mr. Xiaoding lived on Dragon Mountain, east of the city. Because Dragon Mountain Academy was temporarily sealed off by the Mahist army, some teachers and students who didn't have time to escape were temporarily placed in a small courtyard outside Dragon Mountain Academy. Although the Mahist army was full of soldiers, they respected scholars. Since Emo Xiaoyao didn't make things difficult for these people, the soldiers who were ordered to guard the academy naturally wouldn't make things difficult for them. When they arrived at the entrance of the courtyard, they unexpectedly saw a familiar face. Third brother, why are you here? The person guarding the courtyard was Su Qingfeng. With Su Qingfeng's status as the commander of Qi Lin's squad and his relationship with the Su family and the Prince Ding mansion, it was a waste of talent to let him guard this place. No one in the Mahist army would let him do this kind of thing. The only possibility was that Su Qingfeng asked to come here. Su Qingfeng was very happy to see Yi Li. He smiled and said, isn't Dragon Mountain Academy one of the 3 great academies in the world? I've heard a lot about it, so I came to take a look. Yi Li gently shook her head and smiled. She didn't expose him. Su Qingfeng was raised by the Su family and also studied at Dragon Mountain Academy for a few years. However, he had always practiced martial arts and hated sitting in front of a desk to read and write articles. He didn't even attend the imperial examinations. If he was interested in meeting the teachers of Dragon Mountain Academy, he would rather believe that his eldest cousin would get married tomorrow. After thinking about it, Yili also understood Su Qingfeng's thoughts. He definitely didn't agree with Emo Xiuyao killing those people, but he definitely couldn't persuade Emo Xiuyao. So he could only ignore it. Although Su Qingfeng didn't like to read, he was still from the Su family. His respect for scholars was no less than that of anyone in the Su family. With him guarding here, no one dared to cause trouble. "How is Mr. Xiaoding?" Yili asked with a smile. Su Qingfeng shook his head helplessly and pointed inside, indicating for her to take a look. Yili didn't care. She pulled Emo Xiuyao inside. This small courtyard wasn't very big. It was only a courtyard with 2 entrances. The style was somewhat exquisite and elegant in the style of Jiangnan in Dechu State. He didn't know why the Longshan Academy had built such an independent courtyard. Before she stepped into the courtyard, she could hear the sound of reading coming from inside. However, the content of the reading made her not know whether to laugh or cry. It was all mocking the Mahist army and Prince Ding. Yili and Emo Xiuyao stood at the door and silently listened. They didn't go in to disturb him. They saw the person sitting in the courtyard with his back to the door, reading one poem after another. For someone like Yili who didn't know much about poetry, to be able to read so many similar poems without repeating them, if it wasn't for the wrong time and place, she would have worshipped him as a god. When he read something like, "Ambition for the throne, blood flows in Bien City," Yili finally coughed and said with a smile, "Mr. Xiaoding is really in a good mood." Chapter 675. The person sitting with his back to the door was startled, and then turned to look at the door. Realization flashed in his eyes. Prince Ding? Princess Ding? It was only then that Yili saw Mr. Xiaoding's appearance clearly. He was an old man with white hair and beard. His appearance was thin, and his temperament was elegant with a bit of the loftiness and arrogance of a scholar. He did not look like someone from the West Hill, but more like a scholar from the South. Yili pulled Emo Xiuyao into the courtyard and nodded with a smile. "Yes, Junior Yili greets Mr. Xiaoding." Chen Xiufu looked Yili up and down and snorted. "I can't be called a junior by Princess Ding." Yili did not get angry and smiled. "Mr. Xiaoding is very talented. Even my grandfather and uncle have a lot of respect for you. It is natural for me to call you a junior." Hearing this, Chen Xiufu was somewhat moved. Mr. Qingyun and Mr. Hongyu? Although he had lived in the West Hill for a long time, he had heard a little about Princess Ding's family background. Yili smiled. "Yes." Chen Xiufu was silent for a moment. His vigilant and slightly hostile expression softened a bit. He said lightly, "When I was young, I traveled to Eastern Chu to study. I was also taught by Mr. Qingyun in my studies. I also had some friendship with Mr. Hongyu. Of course." His gaze slowly swept over Emo Xiuyao. "I also paid a visit to the regent of Eastern Chu. Who would have thought that 30 years later, the descendants of Emo Lufang and the Su family have all become talents? It is a pity that I have wasted my time. I have not even taught half a successful student." Yili smiled. "Mr. Xiaoding must be joking. At least half of the civil officials in the West Hill are your students. How can you say that you have wasted your time?" The Longshan Academy was one of the 3 great academies in the world. It was not an undeserved reputation. Even though the West Hill valued military power over literature, it was impossible to let a group of illiterate generals take charge of the state affairs. Indeed, half of the officials in the West Hill were from the Longshan Academy. However, Longshan Academy was built by Chen Xiufu single-handedly. Compared to Lishan Academy and Xianghua Academy in the south of Dechu State, Longshan Academy was lacking in resources and could only be ranked at the bottom of the top 3. But with Chen Xiufu's strength alone, in a place like the West Hill where martial arts were valued more than literature, Mr. Qingyun also thought highly of him. As for the fact that the Dragon Mountain Academy did not have any outstanding disciples, it was understandable. Genom of Gojoseon had learned the lesson of Lishan Academy's influence in Dechu State. How could he let Longshan Academy repeat the same mistake? Chen Xiufu's strength alone was far from the Su family's 100 years of scholarly heritage. Even if there were outstanding disciples, they would have long been absorbed or dealt with by Genom of Gojoseon. As a result, Longshan Academy did not have a successor like Su Qingchen who could support the school. If Chen Xiufu passed away in the future, Longshan Academy would probably fall into the hands of Genom of Gojoseon or the Emperor of Xiling. Chen Xiufu's expression softened a little. He finally opened his mouth and invited the 2 to take a seat. After entering the parlor and taking their seats, there was naturally no one to serve tea at this time. Yi Li did not feel that it was beneath her status. She ordered someone to bring water and personally made tea for Qin Xiufu and Emo Xiuyao. Emo Xiuyao had not spoken since they entered the courtyard. Looking at Yi Li calmly pouring tea, a trace of tenderness flashed across his eyes. He glanced at Qin Xiufu warningly. Qin Xiufu drank tea and took in Emo Xiuyao's gaze. He snorted lightly and was not afraid. Mr. Qingyun, you are 80 years old, right? Are you well? After drinking tea for a while, Qin Xiufu asked. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled faintly. Next year is my grandfather's 80th birthday. At that time, I hope Mr. Xiaoding will come to the northwest. The teacup in Qin Xiufu's hand paused. He calmly looked at Yi Li. He understood the meaning behind Yi Li's words. It was a pity that he could not agree. He regretfully shook his head and said, "It's a pity that this old man will not have the fortune to celebrate Mr. Qingyun's birthday. However, over the years, my Longshan Academy has collected a lot of ancient books. Princess, please bring them back to Mr. Qingyun. It can be considered this old man's congratulatory gift. Mr. Qingyun, to have a granddaughter like Princess, he is very fortunate in his later years. This old man will not add flowers to brocade." Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled. She said, "Grandfather has never enjoyed the fortune of this younger generation. It is this younger generation that has caused him a lot of trouble. It is fortunate that grandfather is kind and does not dislike the trouble that we younger generation have caused. Mr. Xiaoding has spent his life's effort for Longshan Academy. Do you really want Longshan Academy to disappear from the world?" Qin Xiufu shook his head and said with a smile, "Fate is like this. We cannot force it." Yi Li said indifferently, "The so-called fate, isn't it chosen by people themselves? Although this younger generation is a woman, I also know that my fate is in my own hands and not in the hands of the heavens. There is another saying, personality determines fate and choices determine life. Mr. Qingyun is not a coward. Your choice determines the future of Longshan Academy. If you want it to exist, it will exist. If you want it to die, it can only die with you." Qin Xiufu was slightly shocked. He stared at Yi Li. After a long time, he sighed and said, "My fate is in my own hands and not in the hands of the heavens. Personality determines fate and choices determine life. Princess Ding is so broad-minded. Prince Ding is so fortunate. Mr. Qingyun is so fortunate. Then, what is Mr. Xiaoding's decision?" Yi Li asked. Qin Xiufu lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "This old man will not submit to the Prince Ding mansion. His Highness Prince Ding is a hero, but killing me and turning me into hundreds of thousands of people is too cruel." When he said this, Qin Xiufu's voice became more hoarse and sorrowful. It was clear that he was extremely angry with Emo Xiuyao's actions. Emo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and gave him a disdainful look. "I will kill you. What can you do to me?" Yi Li helplessly pulled Emo Xiuyao's sleeve. Emo Xiuyao curled his lips and lowered his head to continue drinking his tea. He also understood that it was absolutely useless to persuade someone like Qin Xiufu. Based on his actions in Bian City, even if he told the heavens, Qin Xiufu would not believe him. Even if he put a sword to Qin Xiufu's neck, this person might not believe him. Since that was the case, he did not need to waste the effort. If Li could persuade this person, he would stand on Li's side in the future. This was also a good thing for Li. Although Emo Xiuyao always acted spoiled and shamelessly in front of Yi Li, there were many things that he thought about in the long term that even young Master Qing Chen might not be able to reach. After pacifying Emo Xiuyao, Yi Li turned to Qin Xiufu and said, "This is what this junior wants to ask Mr. Xiaoding for advice. Mr. Xiaoding has literary talent and can speak eloquently, but you should not casually slander my husband's reputation." Qin Xiufu was first stunned that Emo Xiuyao was so easily pacified by Yi Li. Now that he heard Yi Li's words, he was even more confused. He said with some displeasure, "What does princess mean? When did this old man slander Prince Ding?" Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "Just now, this junior listened for half a day outside the door. Mr. Xiaoding's every word was saying that my husband killed the innocent. Is that not slander?" Chapter 676. Qin Xiufu was instantly angered. He stared at Yi Li and said, "Could it be that those people that Prince Ding killed yesterday deserve to die?" Yi Li lowered his eyes and said lightly, "Two armies fight for their own benefits. I have never heard Mr. Xiaoding say anything about how to deal with prisoners of war. The matter of killing the prisoners. Although Prince Ding was ruthless, there was a reason for it. Isn't Mr. Xiaoding's poem too much?" Chen Xiufu stared coldly at Yi Li and said in a low voice, "Could it be that the commoners in the city are not innocent?" Yi Li blinked and said in surprise, "What commoners? When has the Mahist army killed commoners?" Chen Xiufu was also surprised. He had seen Mo Xiuyao take all of the commoners to the execution ground. Although Longshan was not high, the news of them being placed under house arrest in this courtyard was not widely spread. Naturally, he did not know that the commoners had been driven out of Bian City by Mo Xiuyao. Seeing Chen Xiufu's surprised appearance, Yi Li smiled and said, "Mr. Xiuting's information is probably wrong. General Longyang used the commoners of Dechu State as meat shields before the battle. This is not something that a general would do. Although the Northwest and Dechu State have already drawn a clear line, the Mahist army and the commoners of Dechu State are still of the same origin." My husband was angry for a moment. However, the Mahist army did not harm a single person of Bian City. I asked Mr. to investigate this matter. Hearing Yi Li's words, Chen Xiufu was a bit suspicious but also a bit happy. Longshan Academy had been in Bian City for decades. He naturally did not want to see those innocent commoners lose their lives. Carefully looking at Yi Li for a while, he finally determined that Yi Li was not lying to deceive him. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. He stood up and cupped his hands towards Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao, saying, "This old man was wrong. I apologize to Prince Ding and Princess Consort." Chen Xiufu was different from Longyang and Zhu Yan. He had never been an official in the imperial court of West Hill. He had traveled around many countries when he was young and had seen a lot. On the other hand, he did not have a particularly deep obsession with the West Hill court. The characters, customs, and even bloodlines of the Dechu State and the West Hill came from the same source. The main reason he opposed Mo Xiuyao was that Mo Xiuyao had brazenly sent troops to invade the West Hill and wanted to massacre Bian City. Now that he knew it was a misunderstanding, he naturally didn't mind apologizing to Mo Xiuyao, and Yi Li hurriedly got up to support him, saying, "Mr. Xiuting, you don't have to do this. You're staying on the mountain for the time being, so you're naturally a little inaccessible." Chen Xiufu sat down again and asked, "Then, where are the people of Bian City now?" "I don't seem to have seen anyone come back." Yi Li glanced at Mo Xiuyao and said with some shame, "The people of the city have all left." Chen Xiufu didn't need to explain what she meant by leaving. He couldn't help but frown. Although their lives were saved, hundreds of thousands of people had lost their homes. Many people didn't even have enough money to take their belongings with them. Their future days wouldn't be any better. Shaking his head, Chen Xiufu looked at Mo Xiuyao and said, "I remember. The area of the 4 states in the northwest is not very large. Prince's actions. I somewhat understand, but I can't agree." Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and didn't answer. Chen Xiufu said, "Prince can't be thinking of driving away all the people of the West Hill and then moving the people of the Northwest and even the Dechu State here. Please forgive me for speaking bluntly, Prince's actions are even more inappropriate than massacring the city." Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao finally raised his head and asked lightly, "Why?" Chen Xiufu said in a low voice, "The people of the West Hill have lived in these places for generations. If Prince only wants to occupy a piece of land, it's fine. But if Prince wants to drive the people away with so many people in the West Hill, where does Prince want to drive them to? Once they have nowhere to go, even if they are unarmed ordinary people, they will still fight back. It is true that there is enmity between the West Hill and the Dechu State, but the people of the West Hill and the people of the Dechu State may not have any deep enmity. 1,000 years ago, the West Hill and the Dechu State were originally one family. If Prince wants the land of the West Hill, he should know that he has to accept the people of the West Hill." Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li looked at each other. Based on Chen Xiufu's relationship and position with them, it was already profound for him to say such words. It even had some special meaning. Yi Li nodded and said, "Teacher is right. Last night's matter was indeed handled improperly by us. Teacher, please be magnanimous and forgive us. In addition, we have come to visit in the hope that you can help us make up for it." The events of the past 2 days had a great impact on the reputation of the Mahist army. Undeserved reputation was a small matter, but if the news of the Mahist army massacring a city was deliberately exaggerated, the future expedition of the Mahist army was likely to encounter unprecedented stubborn resistance, and even cause unnecessary losses. Chen Xiufu was silent for a moment, and then asked in a low voice, "What does Wang Fei want me to do?" Yi Li said softly, "Teacher Xiuting, please send out a notice to the people of the world that Bian City has returned to normal. The original people of Bian City who are willing to return can still return, and all their belongings will be returned. In addition, reopen the Longshan Academy. Teacher Xiaoting, please recommend a few capable people who can help manage Bian City. Chen Xiufu calmly stared at Yi Li for a long time, but the two people opposite him knew that his heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. Yi Li's request seemed simple, but once he agreed, it was the same as announcing to the world that Teacher Xiaoting would submit to the Prince Ding mansion. Knowing the hesitation and struggle in his heart, the two did not rush him and calmly sat and drank tea. A long time later, a trace of determination flashed across Chen Xiufu's face. He looked at Yi Li and said, I agree to Wang Fei's request, but I also ask the prince and Wang Fei to promise me one thing. Yi Li also sighed in relief and said with a slight smile, Teacher Xiaoting, please tell us. Chen Xiufu said, I ask the prince and Wang Fei to promise that they will not kill the common people of Xiling. Yi Li smiled and said, of course. The Mahist army is not a bloodthirsty army, and has never violated the common people, has it not? Chen Xiufu nodded and said with a smile, I believe Wang Fei, and hope that the prince and Wang Fei will not break their promise. Then please wait and see, Yi Li said with a smile. After sending off Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao, the Mahist army soldiers who had been guarding outside the courtyard also left. This also showed the sincerity of the Prince Ding mansion. In the small courtyard, Chen Xiufu looked at the cold tea on the table in front of him and sighed faintly. Teacher, are we really going to submit to the Prince Ding mansion? This will be detrimental to Teacher's reputation. The Prince Ding mansion will not be able to stop the rumors from spreading, a young student behind Chen Xiufu asked worriedly. Chen Xiufu shook his head and looked up at the sky above the small courtyard. He said in a low voice, fame and infamy are all false. Seeing these two people, I suddenly feel that maybe the situation of the world is really going to change. The Dechu state and Xiling were the two great powers of the time. However, every scholar would remember that 1,000 years ago, there was a vast empire that stood on this land. That era was a time of peace and prosperity that countless people looked up to. There was a saying that, after being together for a long time, they would separate, and after being separated for a long time, they would unite. The world had been divided for too long. When those two people were in front of him, he seemed to finally see an extravagant hope that he had never dared to touch in his entire life, a true dream of peace and prosperity. But didn't Teacher say that Prince Ding's evil spirit was too strong and harmed the harmony of the world? Isn't this a long-term phenomenon? The student asked in confusion. Chen Xiufu chuckled and said, at that time, it was because I didn't see the other person. With her there, perhaps Prince Ding wouldn't have killed so many people. This time, weren't the people of Bian City fine? I was thinking too much. Teacher Qingyun has great foresight, how could he not see this? Since Teacher Qingyun didn't stop Prince Ding from sending troops, it meant that Teacher Qingyun also thought highly of Prince Ding. When he was young, Chen Xiufu also had great ambitions. Unfortunately, his ambitions weren't something that most people could understand. Even more people only thought of it as a kind of arrogant delusion. After hitting a wall too many times, he finally became disheartened and settled down in Dragon Mountain to teach and educate people. He hoped to pass down his ambitions and ideas. Afterwards, the Emperor of Xiling was cowardly and incompetent, Genom of Gojoseon monopolized power, and the Dechu state Mo Jingqi was suspicious and ruthless. The entire Dechu state seemed to be strong and prosperous, but in reality, it was already on the decline. All of these things made him feel even more hopeless and helpless, until he completely gave up. He even dreamed of foreign invasions in the middle of the night. The Dechu state and Xiling no longer existed. He didn't expect that when he was almost 60 years old, he would once again see a glimmer of hope. For the first time in his life, Chen Xiufu was moved and helpless. He had already passed his prime. If only he was 20 years younger. Raising his head to look at the clear and cloudless sky, Chen Xiufu murmured, this old man has accomplished nothing in his life. Death isn't regrettable. But now, I only hope to live a few more years. Perhaps in my remaining years, I can still see true peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity? Behind him, the young student's heart shook. He didn't think that his teacher would have such high expectations for that wall of people. Although he didn't see Prince Ding and his wife with his own eyes, he hid behind and heard their conversation. As he watched the two leave, the young man also felt that there was no one in the world more compatible than them. Teacher will definitely see that day, the young student said in a low voice. Chapter 677. With Mr. Xiaoting's help, the situation in Bian City was much better than they had imagined. After all, in this chaotic world, it wasn't only Bien City that was at war. These ordinary people wouldn't easily choose to leave their homes unless they had no other choice. Although Chen Xiufu wasn't as famous as Mr. Qin Yun, at least in Bien City, he definitely had enough prestige. Although there was a portion of people who were gossiping about him surrendering to Ding Wangfu, but after the citizens saw the notice that he personally wrote, most of them chose to return to Bien City. These ordinary people were very easy to appease. Long Yang's actions on the city wall gave the Mahist army enough and easy-to-understand reasons to explain Mo Xiuyao's previous actions. Although they were frightened and still had some fear of the Mahist army after all, the Mahist army didn't kill any ordinary people in the end, right? Among them, perhaps the good reputation of the Mahist army played a big role. It took 2 days to settle some important matters in Bien City, including the burial of Long Yang and Zhu Yan as great generals. This action also made the people of Bien City, who were originally on guard, have a better impression of the Mahist army. After dealing with these matters, it was time for the Mo family army to continue their journey. Although they believed that with Lu Jingxian blocking, Genom of Gojoseon wouldn't be able to come back to help so quickly, it was better to end this battle quickly. Mo Xiuyao left a small number of troops and temporarily led the people in Bien City. On the morning of the 3rd day he took people and set off again. In a few days the Northwest would naturally send people to take over Bien City. They couldn't leave a large number of troops along the way, especially when the Mahist army didn't have many troops. Just after leaving Bien City, Mo Xiuyao received a battle report from Dechu State. In the north, Leng Huai was bitterly resisting the Northern Region Army at Zijing Pass. The Northern Tribes Army in the north of Dechu State had finally broken through the borders of Dechu State. Countless nomadic cavalrymen of the grassland rushed into the pass, burning, killing, and looting along the way. At the same time, a large number of Dechu State citizens flooded into the northwest, and the Feihong Pass was also frequented by the northern tribes. Although they had no intention of provoking the Mahist army, Su Qingshan had to be careful. At this time, the Dechu State's court was still not united. The struggle for power was even more intense than before. As the regent, Mo Jingli did not throw all of his energy into the battle. Instead, he secretly made preparations. Once the enemy neared the Chujing, he would immediately abandon the Chujing and retreat to Jiangnan. After reading the letter he had just received, Mo Xiuyao threw the letter on the table with a dark expression. He said coldly, "Mo Jingli, that idiot." Sitting beside him, Yili picked up the letter and looked at it. She smiled faintly and said, "The northern region, northern tribes, and Xiling are all brave and skilled in battle. The armies of the 3 countries have all arrived. No wonder Mo Jingli retreated before he was defeated. Leng Haoyu and the others probably won't be able to hold on." Mo Xiuyao pulled Yili to sit beside him. He lowered his head and rubbed her black hair. Leng Huai has finally lived up to his reputation for being able to hold on until now. If the northern tribes and Xiling didn't stir things up, and if the Dechu State's court supported him, the outcome would be uncertain. It's a pity, his luck is not on his side. It's not his fault. Lei Jinting really doesn't plan on withdrawing his troops from the Dechu State? Yili looked at the letter in her hand and asked with a frown. Mo Xiuyao snorted softly and said, "Lu Songshan's 400,000 troops are blocking the front, and the Dechu State's hundreds of thousands of troops are watching from behind. In the south, Nanzhao is eyeing covetously. That's right. There's also Murong Shen leading 200,000 troops north. Lei Jinting can't retreat even if he wants to. If he turns back and is blocked by Lu Jingxian, and Murong Shen catches up with him from behind and joins forces with the Dechu State's troops to surround him from 3 sides. The war god of Xiling, it's not impossible for his army to be wiped out again. Most importantly, even if he breaks through Lu Songshan's defense line and catches up, how many troops does he have? There's also the attack of Nanzhao and the small countries in the western region. At that time, he will have nothing." Yili furrowed her brows and thought for a moment. She asked, "Then what do you think he will do?" Mo Xiuyao rubbed between his brows and thought for a moment. He said, "If he can't retreat, then he can only advance. If he can take Jiangnan before Murong Shen and Mo Jingli, TSK, then it will be a bit troublesome." Yili had to admit that if Lei Jinting took Jiangnan, it would be a bit troublesome. Jiangnan was a rich and populous place that the West Hill could not compare to. Once Lei Jinting took it, it would only take a few years for Lei Jinting to become the overlord of Jiangnan. From then on, he would be free from the status and restrictions of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon, and he would have even more power than he had now. If that was the case, it was hard to say whether they had won or lost this battle. Forget it. Even if we lose, the ones who lose are Mo Jingli and the Dechu state. We must take the West Hill. Mo Xiuyao said in a low voice. The Northwest had no other choice. Considering their reputation, they could not attack the Dechu state. Thus the only choice left was the West Hill. They couldn't let the Mahist army go out of the pass to fight for territory with the northern tribes and become nomads, could they? Yi Li furrowed her brows and thought for a while. Then she smiled and said, maybe we are worrying too much. The Dechu state still has millions of soldiers. Mo Jingli is not so stupid as to let Lei Jinting take over his territory so easily. Besides, if it really doesn't work out, why don't we ask General Lu to help them again? Maybe we can still go back in time. They did not plan to take over the entire West Hill. No matter how weak the West Hill was, it was still a vast country. If they wanted to take over the entire territory, it would be impossible without 2 or 3 years. As long as they could take over the West Hill Imperial City in the shortest time possible, things would be much easier in the future. Mo Xiuyao smiled and lowered his head to kiss Yi Li's forehead. He said with a smile, Yi Li is right. Let me think. Leng Huai's side is already powerless. Let him go back to the northwest. Of course he would also bring back a famous general for them. Although Leng Huai was old, his ability to lead troops was definitely not below Zhang Qilan and Lu Jingxian. The Mahist army had not fought for too many years. There were basically no old generals in the army. The younger generation was also unable to hold their own. Thus, Mo Xiuyao had to personally lead troops into battle. As for how to make Leng Huai willingly work for the Mahist army, that would depend on his ability. Ignoring all this, Mo Xiuyao casually placed the battle report aside and hugged Yi Li to study the map in front of him. Ever since he had Yi Li's Qilin training, Mo Xiuyao had to admit that at least in terms of terrain exploration, it had improved a lot. In the past, even the most experienced scouts in the Mahist army could not explore and draw such a perfect map. They could even create a perfect battlefield sand table. Right now, Lei Tingfeng has brought 30,000 wounded soldiers to defend Feng City. Adding the original defenders of Feng City, the total number is no less than 150,000. It doesn't seem difficult. Let's leave this battle to Qin Yun. Mo Xiuyao pointed to the location on the map and said. Chapter 678. Yi Li nodded in agreement. She thought for a moment and said, however, Feng City is different from Bian City. It is located at the intersection of Shiling's north, south, east, and west. We have to be careful of reinforcements. If we are surrounded, Qin Yun may not be able to handle it. Mo Xiuyao thought for a moment and tilted his head. There shouldn't be many reinforcements. Nanzhao has already sent out its troops. After news of Long Yang's death spread, the kingdoms of the western regions are also restless. Even if they want to send reinforcements, they may not be able to. Besides, I don't think that the Emperor of Xiling really wants Lei Tingfeng to live. The Emperor of Xiling? Yi Li had a flash of inspiration. Lei Jinting is leading troops outside, and now Lei Tingfeng is trapped in Feng City. This is indeed an opportunity for the Emperor of Xiling. Although the Emperor of Xiling was weak and incompetent, for such a weak and incompetent emperor to have not been succeeded by Lei Jinting for more than 20 years, he should have some ability. Although the current situation was very disadvantageous for Xiling, if the Emperor of Xiling wanted to get rid of Jinan Palace, this was the best opportunity. You sent people to find the Emperor of Xiling? Yi Li looked up and asked softly. Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly. Fourth young master Su. Among the 5 sons of the Su family, other than the genius Su Qingchen, the most skilled and most suited to be a lobbyist was the 4th young master of the Su family, Su Qingbai. Most importantly, most people, including Lei Jinting, still thought that the 4th young master of the Su family was still farming in the northwest. Who would have thought that Su Qingbai had secretly run to the Emperor of Xiling City to cut off Lei Tingfeng's escape route? Isn't that too dangerous? Yi Li frowned and asked worriedly. Everything they said was based on the assumption that the Emperor of Xiling was willing to destroy Jinan Palace at all costs. If the Emperor of Xiling was still rational or unwilling to do so, then Su Qingbai would be in danger. Mo Xiuyao played with Yi Li's hand and said softly, "Don't worry. I've hired people to protect him in secret. There won't be any problems." Yi Li was a little surprised by his confidence. "Who is it?" "Ling Taihan and a team of Qilin." Mo Xiuyao laughed. Besides, even if the Emperor of Xiling really did detain Su Qingbai, he wouldn't dare to kill him in this situation. At most, he'll use him to negotiate with us. I'll try to save him. Li, I've said before that I'll protect anyone you care about. I won't let him take any risks. Hearing this, Yi Li's heart softened. She gently leaned into Emo Xiaoyao's arms. For Ling Taihan to protect Su Qingbai, Emo Xiaoyao had to pay a price. Just from this point alone, it was clear that he had put in a lot of effort. Besides, Su Qingbai was also a grown man. He had his own ambitions and aspirations. Yi Li couldn't stop him from doing everything for his safety. If he didn't want to go, Emo Xiaoyao couldn't force him. However, she was a little unhappy that she didn't know about this at all. Prince is really far-sighted? He's already made so many arrangements without anyone noticing? Yi Li lightly leaned against Emo Xiaoyao's chest. After being married for so many years, Emo Xiaoyao could tell that she was unhappy just by hearing her voice. He hugged Yi Li and laughed softly. Doesn't Li dislike these things? As long as Li doesn't like it, why don't you leave it to me? Besides, this was decided before the battle. If Li knew about it at that time, wouldn't Li be put in a difficult position in front of Lady Su? Prince is really considerate. Should I thank you? Yi Li raised her head and looked at him with a smile. Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Of course I am the most considerate husband. Has Li seen anyone better than I? Yi Li rolled her eyes at him in exasperation. Good person? Is there anyone in the world more black-hearted than you, Prince? I have to be careful. Maybe one day I'll be tricked by you. Emo Xiaoyao laughed loudly. Wife can see that husband is so black-hearted. This means that you aren't so innocent. Aren't we a match made in heaven? Husband definitely won't trick Li Li. Standing outside the door, Feng Zhiyao had a conflicted expression. He couldn't decide whether to go in and disturb them. Perhaps Wang Yi was confessing his feelings to Wang Fei. What match made in heaven? Prince, you really have thick skin. Feng San, what is it? Why aren't you going in? Zhang Qilan, who had followed behind them, looked at Feng San, who was standing at the door with a frown. Feng Zhiyao gave a soft cough and glanced exasperatedly at Zhang Qilan. He said loudly, Prince, this subordinate has something to see you about. After being inexplicably glared at, Zhang Qilan felt even more inexplicable and touched his nose. Did he say something wrong? Come in. From inside the tent, Emo Xiaoyao's voice said faintly. Entering the tent, he saw that both the prince and Wang Fei were calmly looking at him. Feng Zhiyao instantly felt that the awkwardness in his heart had become awkward. He really couldn't stay calm. Feng Zhiyao scolded himself in his heart. Yi Li looked at him with a smile and asked, Feng San, General Zhang, what is it? Zhang Qilan looked strangely at Feng Zhiyao and reported in a clear voice, Wang Fei, we are less than 10 li from Feng City. This subordinate requests to lead the troops at the front. Yi Li said with a smile, General has come at the right time. Just now Prince and I had discussed it. Qin Yun should lead the vanguard. They are young and don't have much experience. Such a small matter isn't worth General's personal attention. Zhang Qilan was a straightforward person and didn't have any thoughts of stealing credit. Hearing Yi Li's words, he felt it was reasonable and nodded, saying, if that's the case, this subordinate will follow your orders. Emo Xiaoyao said, the terrain around Feng City is complicated. Qin Yun and the others are still young. You still have to watch from the back to prevent them from falling into an ambush. Zhang Qilan nodded and said seriously, Prince, don't worry. This subordinate understands. Emo Xiaoyao nodded and looked at Feng Zhiyao on the side. Zhang Qilan had come to ask to fight. What had Feng Zhiyao come to do? Feng Zhiyao had also come to ask to fight. But he had been a beat slower after hearing Emo Xiaoyao's words, and Zhang Qilan had taken the lead. Now that Emo Xiaoyao had rejected Zhang Qilan's request, he had nothing to say. To prevent Emo Xiaoyao from settling the score, he hurriedly left with Zhang Qilan. On the border between Dechu State and Xiling, the two armies were in a stalemate. For hundreds of years, there had been many confrontations between the two armies on the border of the two countries. But this time it was different from the past. The Mahist army that was supposed to protect Dechu State stood on the border of Xiling. And the Xiling army, who had been eyeing Dechu State covetously, stood on Dechu State's land, determined to break through the Mahist army's defense and return to Xiling. But whether it was the Mahist army or Lu Jingxian, they were not to be trifled with. Even though Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling was famous all over the world, breaking through the blockade of 400,000 troops was not something that could be done overnight. Moreover, Lu Jingxian had made it clear that he did not want to destroy the enemy, but only wanted to defend. It was almost moonlight, but the Xiling army still could not push back the Mahist army's defense line by even 1 mile. And Murong-shin's 200,000 troops had already come north from the south, and were approaching day by day. Chapter 679. Prince, a report from West Hill. In the tent, a soldier hurried in, presented a letter with both hands and then left. Genom of Gojosian opened the letter and read it. His face, which had not been clear for more than half a month, was gloomy. The soldiers gathered in the tent quickly asked, "Prince, what happened in West Hill?" Genom of Gojosian frowned and said lightly, "Zhu Yan and Long Yang died in battle, and Tingfeng is trapped in Feng City." Everyone was in an uproar. Zhu Yan and Long Yang were not ordinary people. Before Lei Jinting they were the most famous generals in West Hill. They also belonged to the era of Long Yang and Zhu Yan, and represented the most powerful period of the Shilling army. Even Lei Jinting, who was known as the war god of West Hill, had to admit that after losing Zhu Yan and others, the strength of the Shilling army had declined. After all, no matter how powerful Lei Jinting was, he was only one person. He had to command the Shilling army and take care of political affairs. And people often could not take care of everything. But now, in less than a month, West Hill had already lost 4 or 5 cities, and even lost 2 famous generals. How powerful was the Mahist army or Emo Shuyao exactly? How is this possible? Emo Shuyao took Bian City in less than 10 days? Someone exclaimed. Lei Jinting said in a low voice, to be precise, it was 6 days. In 6 days, not only did he take Bian City, but he also annihilated the hundreds of thousands of troops that Zhu Yan hid near Bian City. Although Lei Jinting was also shocked and angry that Zhu Yan hid hundreds of thousands of troops, now Zhu Yan's men were dead, and the Jingwa army was wiped out. There was no point in talking about it. Hearing this, everyone couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. "Prince, what should we do now?" "Prince." Everything else was easy to deal with, but Lei Tingfeng was trapped in Feng City, which was a big problem. Save him? Who should he send to save him? Genom of Gojosian only had one son, Lei Tingfeng. How could he not save him? Lei Jinting sucked in a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Immediately dispatch the gold-clothed guards. No matter what, bring Tingfeng out of Feng City." "Prince, Feng City?" the general asked cautiously. Lei Jinting lowered his eyes and clenched his fists under the table. He said in a deep voice, "We can't care about that now. Tomorrow morning we will turn around and lead our troops south." "Prince." Then the West Hill. After all, they were all generals of the West Hill. It was impossible for them to remain indifferent when they knew that the West Hill might be occupied by the Mahist army. They looked at Lei Jinting with a troubled expression. Lei Jinting frowned and said in a deep voice, "We have been tricked by Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao cannot attack the Dechu state. That is why he led us to attack the Dechu state while he took the opportunity to attack the West Hill. We can't go back now. Once we are entangled with Lu Jinshan's army for too long, Murong-shin and the Dechu state troops behind him will pounce on us and surround us from 3 sides. When that happens, it is unknown how many of us will be able to return to the West Hill." Everyone's expression turned ugly. "Prince, what should we do?" Lei Jinting said indifferently, "Since we can't go back, then we have to go forward. We have to go all the way south and conquer the south of the Dechu state. Now that Murong-shin is going north, we can go south and avoid him. At that time, the worst-case scenario would be us defending the Yunlan River and ruling with the Dechu state. In the short term, the Dechu state does not have the ability to go south and fight with us. The northern region and the northern tribes in the north are enough to keep them busy. In addition, Emo Shuyao will not be able to take over all the land in the West Hill in the short term. At most, he will withdraw his troops when we reach the capital. At that time, we will still be able to coordinate with the West Hill. Tingfeng can control the situation in the West Hill." Everyone was silent. No one asked what would happen if the Crown Prince could not control the situation. At least Lei Jinting had given them a seemingly good way out. Occupying the Jiangnan of the Dechu state, that rich and populous land was something they had dreamed of obtaining. It was also the reason why they had been in constant conflict with the Dechu state for the past 100 years. They were clearly of the same origin. Why should the Dechu state have such a prosperous and populous land, while they could only suffer the cold wind and dust in the northwest? Everyone exchanged glances and whispered for a moment. Finally, they said in unison, "We obey the prince's orders." Lei Jinting nodded in satisfaction. Although he had accidentally fallen into Emo Shuyao's trap this time, he knew in his heart that even if he had to do it again, he would still choose to do the same. With Emo Shuyao and the Mahist army in the northwest, They could only take risks if they wanted to change the previous situation. And the land in the West Hill was too barren compared to the Dechu state. Now, Deputy General, I will give you 300,000 soldiers and horses. Go north and join forces with the northern tribes to attack the Feihong Pass. The rest of you will follow I to the south. After organizing his thoughts, Lei Jinting quickly issued the order. The Deputy General was stunned and said with some confusion, Prince, if we provoke the Prince Ding mansion now, isn't it a little? Lei Jinting snorted softly and said, Don't worry. We don't really need to break through Feihong Pass. We just need to make it look like we are attacking by force. After I lead the troops to the south, don't let Lu Jingxian have the time to come and cause trouble for I. The Deputy General then understood Lei Jinting's thoughts. He couldn't help but ask, if we attack Feihong Pass, will Lu Jingxian come back to help? If so, we can break through the blockade of the Mahist army and go back to the West Hill to help? Lei Jinting shook his head and said, Lu Jingxian is not that stupid. If we go back to the West Hill, he will only stop us at all costs. But if we go south, in his opinion, the Northwest is much more important than Jiangnan, which belongs to Mo Jingli. The Deputy General surrendered. Prince is wise. I did not think it through. I accept the order. Lei Jinting nodded and said, Go. Remember not to act rashly. I have already sent people to contact the general of the northern tribes. There should be news soon. After the northern tribes and the Northwest Mahist army start fighting, you can act according to the situation. I accept the order. After dismissing the generals, Lei Jinting looked at the Northwest in a daze. After a long time he sneered and said, Mo Xiuyao, this time you have won half a round. But after I take Jiangnan. Chapter 680. Mo Jingli was the first to know about Genom of Gojoseon's movements. No matter how stupid Mo Jingli was, he still remembered that Jiangnan was the capital that allowed him to settle down. Moreover, Mo Jingli was never a true idiot. He was just not smart enough compared to some people. Therefore, the moment he received news of Genom of Gojoseon's movements, Mo Jingli ordered Murong Shin, who was leading troops north, to stop Genom of Gojoseon from going south. Murong Shin had led troops north because the troops in the north had been badly beaten up by Genom of Gojoseon. He had originally come to settle accounts with Lei Jinting. Naturally, he did not care where he would settle accounts with him. After receiving Mo Jingli's order, he immediately led the army that was originally heading north to the southeast. He wanted to block the front of the Xiling army. Even after making these plans, Mo Jingli still could not be at ease. He secretly ordered his confidants to secretly prepare to move the capital to the south. He completely did not think about the lives of the soldiers who were still fighting the north and the northern tribes. However, Mo Jingli's actions were not truly hidden from everyone. Very quickly, a secret letter was sent to Zijing Pass in the northeast of the Chu capital. At Zijing Pass, the battles that were getting more and more difficult by the day caused Leng Huai to grow much older and thinner in the past month. The army in the north seemed to know that the Dechu state was an arrow at the end of its flight. Ever since the northern tribes entered the pass, they began to attack even more crazily. Leng Huai had reason to believe that the northern tribes and the northern tribes had secretly colluded long ago. However, the rations that the Chu capital sent to Zijing Pass were decreasing by the day. Ever since the new emperor ascended the throne, the rations for this month had been delayed for 10 days and still had not arrived. If there was still no rations after 10 days, the Dechu state would lose without a fight even if the northern tribes did not attack. Father, what's the matter? Leng Haoyu, who was suddenly called into the study, looked at his old father with a leisurely and unruly expression, as if he couldn't understand where his father's worries came from. Leng Huai was infuriated by his calm demeanor. He didn't know when it started, but this son of his had always acted like he didn't care about anything even if the sky fell down. Although Leng Huai already knew that Leng Haoyu wasn't really that kind of playboy, he still couldn't help but want to get angry when he saw him like this. What's with the grin on your face? Leng Huai said in a deep voice. Leng Haoyu pursed his lips. Could it be that he wanted to be like eldest Leng, who had a sullen face all day long, as if someone owed him millions of taels of silver? Rolling his eyes, Leng Haoyu said, Father, what's the matter? I'm going to accompany Ting Er to play. Leng Huai's veins on his forehead throbbed. Play? What time is it now? You still have time to play with your wife? What's wrong with your wife? You're not sensible and she's not sensible either? She's always fooling around. Leng Haoyu didn't care if he was criticized, but it was not okay if his wife was criticized. Leng Haoyu said unhappily, "What's wrong with my wife? She can take care of the family, have children, do business with me, and accompany me to the battlefield. Even if she's not as good as Princess Ding, she's not bad. Can your wife do it? Can your eldest daughter-in-law do it?" As he spoke, Leng Haoyu gradually became complacent, as if he felt that his wife was really very good. Leng Huai couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth when he saw him like this. He said helplessly, "I didn't call you here to hear you brag about your wife. Am I bragging? I'm telling the truth, okay?" Leng Haoyu muttered in a low voice in dissatisfaction. He thought to himself, wasn't it you who started it? Why didn't you say it earlier? What's the matter? Father, just say it. Leng Huai frowned and said in a deep voice, "What happened in the capital? Don't say you don't know. I know you have another source of information." Leng Haoyu couldn't help but smile at him. He raised his head and asked, "Then father, do you know where my source of information came from? Do you really want to use it? If you use it, what will you use to return it?" This. Leng Huai was speechless, although Leng Haoyu never said anything. However, Leng Haoyu didn't deliberately hide anything from him in the past few months. He more or less guessed what his son had been doing all these years. Although he was shocked and angry at his son's boldness and recklessness, on the other hand, as a father, he also felt proud and relieved that his son could have such ability and achievements without the help of his family. Leng Haoyu wasn't in a hurry. He smiled and waited for his father to make a decision. After a long while, Leng Huai glared at him angrily and said, "You're my son. As a father, do I have to pay for asking you for information?" Leng Haoyu raised his eyebrows and looked at him with some ridicule. He didn't make things difficult and shrugged, "Actually, it's nothing. Genom of Gojoseon's road back to Xiling was cut off by Prince Ding. He planned to abandon his hometown and go to Jiangnan to snatch Prince Li's territory. Of course, Prince Li wasn't willing to give up his territory so easily, so he was secretly preparing to return to Jiangnan. If he wants to return to Jiangnan, he naturally has to bring many things and even military forces back. How would he have the time to care about your small Zijing Pass? Anyway, Prince Li isn't the emperor. Even if the capital is gone, there's still the prosperous land of Jiangnan. It's not a loss to him." What? Leng Haoyu said it casually, but Leng Huai's face turned pale when he heard it. How is that possible? Doesn't Prince Li know that once the capital is lost, more than half of the Dechu state will be finished? Leng Haoyu raised his eyebrows and said, "Why are you asking me if you don't believe me? So what if Prince Li doesn't give up? The northern tribes have already entered the pass. It won't be long before they attack the Chu capital. When that time comes, can your Zijing Pass still hold on? If you retreat then, I'm afraid that Mo Jingli won't even be able to keep Jiangnan. Of course he has to leave first. When he goes to Jiangnan, he doesn't need to be a regent. When the young emperor is killed by the northern tribes or the northern region, he can directly ascend to the throne and become the emperor." Leng Huai was speechless. Although Leng Haoyu's words were crude and unadorned, they undoubtedly hit the nail on the head. But how could he be willing to give up the Zijing Pass that he had defended for so long, especially when he knew the consequences of giving up? "Then why did you come? Prince Ding naturally has his own plans for you to come, right? Does Prince Ding really want to watch the Dechu state fall?" Since things had reached this point, Leng Huai didn't avoid Leng Haoyu's identity anymore. Leng Haoyu's expression immediately turned ugly. He sneered, "Why did I come? Who asked you to run to the battlefield at such an old age so recklessly? Generally speaking, I wanted to see if I should collect your corpse or Leng Qingyu's. As for Prince Ding, you can give up. Prince Ding is in Xiling right now. Even if he changes his mind, he can't grow wings and fly back." No matter what Mo Xiuyao was thinking, Leng Haoyu appeared here because he was worried that his father would accidentally kill him on the battlefield. He didn't expect the other party to not appreciate it at all. It was no wonder that Leng Haoyu's expression turned ugly. Leng Huai also knew that he had been too anxious and said too much, so he didn't care that Leng Haoyu's words were unpleasant. Looking at his son's ugly expression, he couldn't help but sigh. Forget it. In a few days, bring Ting back to the capital. Leng Haoyu raised his eyebrows. What do you mean? Chapter 681. Leng Huai said in annoyance, "You also said that we can't hold on to Zijing Pass anymore. Your elder brother and I are generals of the Dechu state. Dying on the battlefield is something we ought to do. Don't tell me you want to join in the fun? Hurry up and leave while the situation is still better. The Lung family. If you have the ability, take care of the Lung family. Even if he was loyal to the Dechu state and the imperial family, he didn't really plan on sacrificing all of his sons. Lung Huai wasn't a subject of the Dechu state to begin with. Lung Huai naturally had him leave without any pressure. Lung Haoyu didn't appreciate this kindness. He rolled his eyes and said, "Take care of your wife, son and grandson yourself. I begged the prince not to come to Zijing Pass to collect your corpse." Lung Haoyu silently complained in his heart. Lung Huai only thought that he had a knot in his heart about the Lung family. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Fine, everyone has their own fate. It's up to you." Lung Haoyu frowned and looked at Lung Huai. "Have you never thought of retreating? Do you really plan on letting these hundreds of thousands of soldiers die with you in Zijing Pass?" Lung Huai smiled bitterly. "Retreat? Retreat to where? Behind us is the Chu capital. We can retreat, but where can these ordinary people retreat to? This old man hasn't fought any earth-shattering battles in my life, but I've never been a coward who abandoned a city and fled." Lung Haoyu could only roll his eyes and wave his hand. "Fine, I don't care about you. You don't care about me either. When it's time to leave, I'll naturally leave." If it really came down to it, he would knock this old man unconscious and bring him to the northwest. Although he didn't like this old man, he didn't plan on sending his father to his death so early. What's more, His Highness wanted a general who could fight. And he was just over 50 years old. He wasn't that old. He could still lead soldiers for a few more years. Lung Huai felt very uncomfortable under his son's strange gaze, but he couldn't guess what he was thinking. She could only wave her hand to dismiss him. On the other hand, Lung Huai was still holding the fort at Redbud Pass, temporarily blocking the advance of the Northern Army. On the other hand, it was not so easy. Most of the Northern Tribe's soldiers were cavalry. Furthermore, the weather outside the Great Pass was already bad. The Northern Tribe's soldiers were much more ferocious than the Dechu state soldiers. Even their war horses were the best in the world. In terms of cavalry, only the Mahist Army's Black Cloud Cavalry could compare to the Northern Tribes. However, the Black Cloud Cavalry was much smaller than the Northern Tribes. Moreover, the Black Cloud Cavalry was good at long-distance raids, leaving after one attack. Even if they were to face the Northern Tribes, they might not be able to defeat them. Thus, it was not hard to imagine what would happen after the hundreds of thousands of Northern Tribes' cavalrymen entered the pass. The Northern Tribes were slightly different from the Northern Tribes. Although the Northern Tribes were mostly barbarians, Ren Qining or Lin Yuan was from the Central Plains. He had also recruited many capable people from the Central Plains. He also knew that what he wanted to do was to rule the Central Plains, not destroy it. Thus, even though the Northern Tribes' army could not be said to be invincible, there would not be any large-scale massacres. However, the Northern Tribes were different. The Northern Tribes were completely nomadic people. They killed their way into the Central Plains in order to take over the fertile land and rich resources for themselves. Thus, when faced with the people of Dechu State who originally had these resources, they would naturally kill them mercilessly. Wherever the Northern Tribes' army went, there would be cries of misery and blood flowing like rivers. Most of the people along the way would die. The atmosphere in the regent's residence in the Chu capital was heavy. Duke Hua glared at the calm Mo Jingli in front of him with wide eyes. Duke Hua's idea of guarding the border was not realized in the end. It was not that Mo Jingli did not believe in Duke Hua's ability, but he was also wary of Duke Hua like Mo Jingqi. Although no one said it on the surface, Mo Jingli knew where the missing empress had gone. He naturally had reason to believe that Duke Hua's residents had already found a place for him to retreat. He was worried that Duke Hua would lead the Dechu State army to the northwest. "Prince, the Northern Tribes' army has already entered the pass. The Northern Tribes' army is also pressing in. Why is Prince still unwilling to give the provisions to General Lung?" Duke Hua asked sternly. Mo Jingli's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise. He said calmly, "Old Duke, you are very well informed." Duke Hua snorted and said calmly, "I have been on the battlefield for half my life. I still have 2 old friends in the army." Although the Hua family and Lung Huai family did not get along well, Lung Huai had spent some time under Duke Hua's command when he first entered the battlefield. Therefore, it was not strange for Duke Hua to ask now. Mo Jingli of course did not believe Duke Hua's words, but he did not show it. He only said calmly, "Old Duke, you should know that since the Mahist army broke off relations with the Dechu state, the North will not be able to withstand it sooner or later." Speaking of this, Mo Jingli was not depressed. Even if he was not the emperor, he was the actual ruler of the Dechu state. No one in power would be willing to see their territory being invaded. However, this was the reality and he had to admit it. Du Qua sneered and said, "Without provisions and without reinforcements, they will not be able to hold on." I know that King Li's base is in the south. When he heard that the West Hill Regent is sending troops south, he is naturally anxious. Du Qua. Mo Jingli's face flashed with anger. He said in a low voice, "Du Qua, please be careful with your words." Du Qua did not back down at all. Am I wrong? The prince embezzled Leng Huai's provisions and did not give any reinforcements to the north. Is it not because he wants to go south? Mo Jingli's eyes flashed with embarrassment. He said angrily, "The south is more important than the north. If Jiangnan is also occupied by Lei Jinting, the north will not be able to withstand it. What should we do if we are sandwiched in the middle and attacked from both sides?" All of this is caused by Mo Xiaoyao. If he did not run to attack the West Hill and block Lei Jinting's escape route, why would Lei Jinting turn his attention to Jiangnan? Hearing this, Du Qua looked calmly at Mo Jingli as if he was looking at an ignorant child. Mo Jingli also understood that he was being unreasonable. The Prince Ding mansion had clearly broken off relations with the Dechu state. Whether it was Mo Xiaoyao attacking the West Hill or cutting off Lei Jinting's escape route, it was all for his own benefit. It was none of Mo Xiaoyao's business whose interest would be harmed in this. As a person in power, he would not value the benefits of others more than his own. In addition, if the Dechu state did not disappoint, they could work together with the Prince Ding mansion to trap Lei Jinting. It was their own incompetence that allowed Lei Jinting to lead his troops south and sweep everything before him. However, Mo Jingli could not help but want to vent his anger. If it were not for Mo Xiaoyao, there would not be so many problems. After gathering his thoughts, Mo Jingli did not want to continue discussing who was right and who was wrong with Du Qua. Most of the old people in court were biased towards the Prince Ding mansion. Even now that the Prince Ding mansion had abandoned the Dechu state and brought great disaster to the Dechu state, these people would still speak up for Mo Xiaoyao. This situation made Mo Jingli jealous, hateful and helpless. "Husband Hua, you didn't come to I's residence just to discuss this matter with I, right?" Mo Jingli put on an indifferent expression and asked. Chapter 682. Du Qua glanced at him. Things had already come to this point. He was not here to discuss the issue of military supplies. Was he here to drink tea with him? Mo Jingli said, "Actually, old Duke does not need to worry about these matters. Naturally, the officials in the court will take care of it." "Does old Duke think that all the officials in the court are useless?" Du Qua sneered. Mo Jingli had not learned any skills in these few years, but he had learned to speak in a bureaucratic manner. The officials in the court were indeed not useless, but none of them had solved the problem at the border. Like King Li, there were quite a few people who were secretly packing up their belongings and preparing to head south. Du Qua looked at Mo Jingli and said in a low voice, "Since the northern tribes entered the pass, they have killed many people. The areas that were invaded by the northern tribes have been filled with crimson corpses. I wonder if Prince has heard of this?" Mo Jingli was taken aback and nodded, "I have heard of it. However, the rumors are not true. Old Duke, you are thinking too much." Du Qua was so angry that he laughed. "Rumors? Not true. I do not believe that King Li does not know whether it is a rumor or not. After the Chu capital, the road to the south is flat. Do I know where King Li plans to retreat to? To the south of the Yunlan River? The northern tribes are not good at water battles. This is a good idea. However, I would like to ask, where does King Li place the millions of people in the north of Dechu state?" Seeing that Mo Jingli was silent, Du Qua's old face was filled with sorrow. He looked at Mo Jingli with pain and said, "King Li, those people who were killed are the people of Dechu state. They are your Mo family's people." Mo Jingli's face was gloomy. He stared at Du Qua and said, "Du Qua, are you criticizing I?" Du Qua smiled bitterly and said, "How can this old man dare to criticize the regent? I only remember that the regent Mo Lufang said one thing, the one who wins the people's hearts wins the world. His Highness Prince Li treats his own people as objects that can be casually thrown away, so how can you expect them to be loyal to you?" When the Prince Regent first took over, the situation in Dechu state wasn't much better than it is now. "Enough." Mo Jingli rudely interrupted Du Qua's words. Du Qua's earnest advice sounded more like sarcasm in his ears. Coldly looking at the old man in front of him, Mo Jingli sneered, "I don't have the ability of Mo Xiaoyao and Mo Lufang, But so what? Do you want I to invite Emo Shuyao back for you, or do you want I to ask His Majesty to abdicate the throne to Emo Shuyao? Du Qua was so angry that his entire body trembled. If the previous emperor could be considered a scheming and ambitious person, then Emo Jingli and the Emo brothers were the oddities of the Emo family. They were already in such a situation, yet they still refused to reflect on themselves, and instead pushed the blame onto others. With such a descendant, the Chu state was truly finished, wasn't it? Du Qua took a few deep breaths, calming the anger in his heart. Finally he stood up and said, "Fine, Prince Li won't listen to this old man's words, so this old man won't bother you anymore. I ask Prince Li to quickly transfer rations and reinforcements to support the northern tribes' front lines." Du Qua swallowed his anger, but Emo Jingli's anger had not completely dissipated. He coldly looked at Du Qua and said, "Du Qua, I remember that you've already retired from your position for a long time. Whether or not you transfer rations, whether or not you give reinforcements, and when you give them is up to I, Du Qua, you should return to your residence and rest. Perhaps in a few days we'll have to leave for the south. If something happens to Du Qua along the way, I won't be able to explain it to the Hua family." "This old man will not leave the capital," Du Qua said firmly. Emo Jingli did not care. Whether Du Qua wanted to leave the capital or not was not up to him to decide. Although Du Qua had not led troops for many years, he still had many old friends in the army. Emo Jingli would definitely not let him stay in the capital. Rather than letting Emo Shuyao take advantage of him, he would rather give the capital to the northern tribes and the northern tribes. As for Du Qua's wishes, they were completely out of Emo Jingli's consideration. If Du Qua really did not want to cooperate, he did not mind using force. Prince Li? How could Du Qua not see through Emo Jingli's plan? Not only his plan, but Du Qua could also guess what he was thinking. It was because of this that he felt even more upset. With Emo Jingli's temperament, let alone in this chaotic world, even in a peaceful time, he was not suitable to be a ruler. Du Qua composed himself and said in a low voice, "This old man will definitely not leave the capital. If Prince Ding insists, why don't you try to bring this old man's corpse out of the capital?" Emo Jingli frowned in displeasure. Although he did not like Du Qua very much, Du Qua was still one of the 4 officials in the capital. However, since Du Qua was the only old official in the capital who had experienced 4 dynasties, he did not dare to force Du Qua to his death. Moreover, persuading those old fellows to agree to move the capital was also a big matter. If Du Qua openly opposed it, many of the old officials would not agree. He frowned and said, "Du Qua, I am doing this for your own good. You're already so old, why don't you go to Jiangnan and enjoy your old age? As for the capital, one day we will return." Du Qua laughed coldly, "Enjoy my old age? When I dream of those innocent people crying, this old man can't sleep. I can't sleep. This old man has lived long enough. I vow to live and die with the capital." Emo Jingli stood up angrily. He stared at Du Qua for a while before coldly saying, "I will not give you a single soldier." Then he flicked his sleeves and left. Du Qua was left sitting in the parlor in a daze. Finally he looked up to the sky and sighed, "Idiot. The Chu state has such an idiot." A line of old tears rolled down his wrinkled face. Looking at the regent's residence that was resplendent and richly decorated, he could only slowly stand up and walk out. The Chu state is finished. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.